Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into The Fiction Wizard, presenting to you today, what if Sorting Hat detected 89 memory charms on Harry and demanded immediate Gringotts inheritance test before sorting? Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1. The Hat Speaks. The Great Hall smelled like roast chicken and candle wax, and 400 students were trying very hard not to stare at the 11-year-old standing in a nervous clump near the doors. Harry stood third from the left in the line, which meant he had a decent view of the floating candles, the 4 long house tables packed with students craning their necks, and the staff table where Professor McGonagall stood with her clipboard looking like she'd been carved from particularly stern marble. He could also see the stool at the front of the hall, and the old, patched, filthy hat sitting on it, and the general shape of what was about to happen. He wasn't scared, exactly. He'd been more scared during any random Tuesday at the Dursleys. This was just loud and bright and full of people looking at him, which was different from scary. It was more like standing in the middle of a storm that hadn't decided yet whether to rain on you specifically. Ron Weasley was behind him somewhere, whispering to a Weasley twin, Fred or George, Harry still couldn't tell, about something to do with a boy named Neville and a toad. Hermione Granger, the girl he'd met on the train who'd already memorized most of their textbooks, was to his right with her chin up and her hands clasped in front of her like she was waiting to receive a medal. She looked like she'd been preparing for this exact moment since she was 4. The hat on the stool opened a tear near its brim, and Harry realized that was its mouth, and then the hat sang. It wasn't a bad song. It covered the houses: brave Gryffindor, wise Ravenclaw, fair Hufflepuff, cunning Slytherin, and explained more or less what it was looking for in each, and Harry listened because it seemed rude not to. Around him, first-years were nodding or shifting their weight from foot to foot. Ron muttered that his brothers had told him about the singing but that knowing about it didn't make it less weird. The song ended. The hall applauded. McGonagall unrolled her scroll. Abbott, Hannah. A round-faced girl with blonde pigtails broke from the group and walked to the stool, sat down, and had the hat dropped over her head. 20 seconds later it opened its mouth and shouted, Hufflepuff, and the table on the right side of the hall erupted. Harry watched the procession. Hermione went before him, placed the hat on her head herself before McGonagall could do it. The professor's lips twitched at that, and the hat took barely 4 seconds to shout, Gryffindor. Hermione walked to the table looking like she'd expected nothing less. Neville Longbottom, a round-faced boy who'd lost his toad twice already today, walked to the stool with the expression of someone approaching a dentist's appointment. The hat covered his entire head and sat there for nearly a full minute before calling Gryffindor. Neville looked surprised, then relieved, then he walked into the table on his way to his seat. Potter, Harry. The hall didn't just go quiet. It went the particular quality of quiet that comes from several hundred people all inhaling at the same time. Harry felt the shift like a change in air pressure. He walked forward, and as he walked he heard the whispers start, moving along the tables like wind through grass. Harry Potter. Did he say Potter? That's Harry Potter. Is that? Look at his forehead. He sat on the stool. McGonagall lowered the hat onto his head, and the world went dark. The hat's voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, directly inside his skull. It was old, this voice. Ancient in the way that stone is ancient, not just a long time, but a different kind of time, time that had absorbed things and remembered them. Well, said the hat. Well. Harry didn't say anything. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to. Interesting, said the hat, and its voice had shifted slightly, taken on a more careful quality, the way a doctor's voice changes when they notice something unexpected in an examination. Very interesting. Then it went quiet. Not the thinking quiet from Neville's sorting. This was different. This was the silence of something stopping, something that had been moving forward and had suddenly, sharply braked. Harry felt something he couldn't name, a pressure behind his eyes, a warmth that swept from the crown of his head down through his spine, like being submerged in warm water that somehow moved through him rather than around him. Boy, said the hat, and its voice had changed completely now. Every trace of the amiable, performing quality it had used for the song was gone. What remained was something that sounded very old and very serious indeed. "Boy, be still. I need you to be very still." Harry was still. The warmth intensified, then spread, then began to pulse. He became aware, in some peripheral way he couldn't explain, of something in his mind that felt like texture. Like layers. Like he was reaching back through memory and finding, instead of the smooth continuity he expected, a series of walls. Seams. Places where something had been joined and the joining had been imperfect, and you could feel the edges if you pressed. The hat pressed. "Oh," it said. Then, with a quality in its voice that Harry had absolutely no framework for, something between fury and grief and the cold, precise outrage of something whose entire purpose has been violated, the hat said it again. "Oh. McGonagall," said the hat. Out loud. Not in Harry's head, out loud, in the hall, in a voice like the creak of an ancient door. "Come here." The hall's silence deepened into something that didn't have a name. McGonagall crossed the floor in 3 quick strides, and Harry, from under the hat's brim, could see her feet, could feel her presence close. "What is it?" she said, and her voice was low, controlled, but Harry could hear the edge in it. She recognized, the way experienced people recognize things, that this was not normal. "How many memory charms," said the hat, "does it take before it constitutes criminal conspiracy, under Clause 7 of the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy Enforcement Protocol?" Dead silence. "3 or more constitutes, I have found," said the hat, and its voice was enormous now in the silent hall, filling the space up to the enchanted ceiling where false stars glittered on a clear Scottish night, 89 distinct memory charms layered across the mind of Harry James Potter. Cast at various intervals over a period of approximately 10 years. Some clumsily. Some with extraordinary precision. All of them deliberate. Harry heard someone drop something at one of the tables. The sound of the goblet hitting the stone floor was very loud. 89, said McGonagall, and her voice had gone very flat. 89, confirmed the hat. Several of which appear to have been cast on an infant. An infant, Minerva. The silence in the hall had passed through quiet and calm and landed somewhere that felt like the moment before a thunderstorm, charged, breathless, heavy with something about to break. Dumbledore rose from his chair at the staff table. Harry couldn't see his face, the hat still covered his head, but he heard the scrape of the chair and felt the change in the room that Dumbledore's movement caused. The man had a physical presence that altered spaces, even in a room this large. "Perhaps we should," Dumbledore began, and his voice was warm, measured, the voice of a man accustomed to controlling rooms. "No," said the hat. "Just that. One word." "Sorting Hat, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore," said the hat, and there was something in the way it said all 4 names that made even the headmaster stop moving. "I am a magical artifact bound by oaths that predate this school by 3 centuries. I am not on your staff. I do not answer to the Board of Governors, the Ministry of Magic, or the International Confederation of Wizards. I answer to my function. My function is to sort children. To sort children, I must examine their minds. I have examined this child's mind and found it violated, and my function does not allow me to proceed as though I have not." McGonagall's feet shifted. Harry heard her quick intake of breath. "I am invoking," said the hat, "the Founder's Protocol, Article 3. The right of any magically sovereign being, which I am, to halt proceedings and demand remedy when a child presented for sorting has been found to be under active magical coercion. This protocol has not been invoked in 412 years. It has never been needed." A pause. "It is needed now." "What does that mean?" Harry said, and then immediately wondered if he was supposed to say that. The hat made a sound like the wind in an old attic, which might have been a sigh. "It means, boy, that before I sort you, you are going to Gringotts." Tonight. It's 8 o'clock at night, said a voice from the Gryffindor table, which Harry thought might be one of the Weasley twins, and then a hand clamped over that voice. Gringotts, said the Hat, operates under Goblin jurisdiction, which does not recognize the British wizarding clock, the Hogwarts feast schedule, or your convenience. The goblins will come when called, and they will be called. Another pause. Article 3 does not permit delay or substitution. The inheritance test will be conducted before any sorting occurs. The test will be conducted under Goblin law, which is older and, frankly, more honest than your law. And when it is done, we will know exactly who has been doing what to this child's mind and why, and this hall will know it too, because Article 3 requires the findings to be announced in the place where the protocol was invoked. The Hat seemed to take a breath, though hats didn't breathe. This was not my choice. Someone made it necessary. Dumbledore stood very still at the staff table. McGonagall said, quietly and precisely, Albus. Did you know about this? The pause before his answer was not quite long enough to be damning, but it was also not quite short enough to be innocent. This is not the time, he said, for, it is exactly the time, said McGonagall. Harry reached up and lifted the hat off his own head because the brim was cutting into his vision and he wanted to see the room. McGonagall didn't stop him. He looked at the hall, 400 faces looking back at him, ranging from confused to frightened to agog, and then he looked at Dumbledore, this tall old man with the long silver beard and the half-moon glasses, and tried to read his face. Dumbledore looked at Harry with an expression that was very carefully composed into something benign and grandfatherly. But underneath it, and Harry wasn't sure how he could see underneath it, only that he could, there was something else. Something that looked, to Harry's unsettling recognition, like the face people make when they've been caught out and are deciding how much to admit. Right, said Harry. He turned to McGonagall. How do we call the goblins? McGonagall blinked. Then something shifted in her expression, something that had been rigid went quiet, and what replaced it was a very different kind of attention. She was looking at him the way you look at something you've misjudged. I'll send a Patronus to Gringotts, she said, as the invocation protocol requires. Mr. Potter, she stopped. Harry. Are you all right? I've had 89 memory charms done on me, Harry said. I don't know what I'd feel like without them, so I can't tell if this is all right or not. He thought about it. I think I want to know what they were hiding. Yes, said McGonagall, in a voice that had gone a little rough at the edges. Yes, I imagine you do. She turned and her wand was in her hand with the ease of someone who'd been casting for 50 years, and a silver cat erupted from the tip in a clean, bright leap and streaked through the wall of the great hall without pausing. The hall was still completely silent. Then Dumbledore spoke, and his voice had resumed its warm, resonant quality, and he said, perhaps, while we wait, the students might stay, said the Hat, which Harry had set down on the stool beside him. Article 3 requires the findings announced in the place of invocation, in the presence of witnesses. These students are witnesses. They stay. A first year near the back of the cluster, a small, dark-haired girl Harry didn't know yet, sat down on the floor and folded her hands in her lap like she'd decided to get comfortable. 2 Gryffindor students at the nearest table, both third years by the look of them, exchanged a wide-eyed look that communicated something like this is the best first feast anyone has ever had. Hermione, sitting at the Gryffindor table, had her eyes fixed on Harry with an expression he couldn't decode. It wasn't the wondering, reverent look the other students were giving him, it was sharper, more analytical, like she was turning information over and examining it from multiple angles. Harry turned to the remaining first years still standing in their nervous cluster. He found Neville's face, pale, uncertain, but meeting his gaze. You can all sit down, Harry said, because it seemed like someone should say it. No point standing. They sat down. Several of them sat on the floor where they were. Ron sat down next to Harry on the stone floor with the casual ease of someone who sat on floors all the time, which Harry suspected was accurate for a house with 7 children. "89, Ron said, very quietly. "Yeah," said Harry. That's. Ron appeared to be struggling with the mathematics of the outrage. "My mum can barely hold 2 consecutive memory charms in sequence during practice drills." 89 takes, more than one person, Harry said. Ron looked at him. Harry shrugged. It had just seemed like an obvious conclusion. They waited. The floating candles burned. The enchanted ceiling wheeled slowly through its false stars. At the staff table, the professors had the quality of a roomful of adults who had things to say to each other that they weren't saying because there were children present, and the silence between them was dense with unsaid things. Quirrell was turning his purple turban over and over in his hands. Snape sat very still with an expression carved from something harder than marble, looking at Harry with dark eyes that gave nothing away. Flitwick had taken out a small notebook and appeared to be writing things down. Hagrid, at the far end of the staff table, was staring at Dumbledore with an expression of raw distress, the face of a large, uncomplicated person who'd found out that something they'd trusted completely was maybe not trustworthy, and hadn't yet finished processing what that meant. 20 minutes passed. Then the doors of the Great Hall opened. Not swinging open, they opened, both panels simultaneously, with a kind of smooth precision that suggested they'd been instructed rather than pushed. 2 goblins walked in, and Harry looked at them with the frank curiosity of someone who'd only seen a goblin once before, briefly, at Gringotts that morning. He'd been more focused on the vaults then. These goblins were not the tellers from the morning. They were taller, not tall, but taller, with a collected authority in how they moved, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. The one on the left carried a case of dark wood and brass fittings. The one on the right carried nothing but wore, at his belt, 3 or 4 items Harry couldn't identify that radiated the same sense of don't that very secure locks radiated. Behind them, a third goblin walked, shorter than the other 2, with a face like a cliff face and eyes the color of old bronze. He wore robes that were finer than the others and carried himself with the specific gravity of someone who was here because the law required him to be, which was completely different from someone who was here because they'd been asked. "Sorting hat," this goblin said, addressing the hat on the stool with the precise respect one gives to an equal. "Gringotts Bank acknowledges your invocation of the Founder's Protocol, Article 3. We are here to conduct the inheritance test." He looked at Harry, and his gaze was clinical, thorough, and about as emotional as an audit. "You are Harry James Potter?" "Yes," said Harry. "Are you here of your own will, uncoerced, for the purpose of this test?" "I'm 11, Harry said. "I wasn't really given a choice." The goblin who'd spoken made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, it was more like the sound of a point being acknowledged. "The protocol itself is the compulsion. Once invoked, neither child nor guardian may refuse. The question is a formality required by goblin law." He studied Harry. "You may answer yes." "Yes," Harry said. "Good. I am Sharpclaw, Senior Accounts Investigator, Gringotts Bank, London. I will conduct this test. It will not hurt, though it may be illuminating." He said illuminating the way someone says a word they've chosen carefully because the accurate word was too large for the context. "You will need to bleed." "All right," Harry said. "Just, all right," said Ron, from beside him. "It's probably my own blood," Harry said, "which makes it less concerning than most of the times blood has been involved in my day." Sharpclaw looked at him again with those bronze eyes. "Come here, Potter." Harry stood and crossed to where the goblins had set up their equipment. The case had been opened to reveal a shallow stone basin, a crystal vial, a quill made from something that wasn't feather, and what appeared to be a very small knife with a blade the color of old starlight. "Left hand," Sharpclaw said, and Harry extended it. The small knife was quick and precise and barely stung. 3 drops of blood fell into the basin, and then the stone lit from beneath with a deep amber glow. The quill moved on its own. It wrote for a long time. Harry watched the words appear, and the hall watched with him, and the silence had a different quality now, not the silence of shock but the silence of a room holding its breath for a reason, the silence of people who could feel something changing. The quill stopped. Sharpclaw read what had been written, and his expression, already the most controlled thing Harry had ever seen, went through a sequence of small, controlled adjustments that added up to something significant. He looked up at Harry. "Your full legal name," he said, "is Harrison James Potter Black Peveril Gryffindor, heir to the most ancient and noble houses of Potter and Black, heir by conquest to the Peveril line, and direct patrilineal descendant through the female line of the founder Godric Gryffindor." The silence broke. It didn't break in a dramatic way, it broke the way ice breaks in spring, in multiple places at once, and the noise that replaced it was chaotic and layered, students talking over students, a professor making a sharp exclamation, someone's goblet knocked over again. Harry stood in the center of it and looked at the parchment. "What does heir by conquest mean?" he asked. "It means a direct ancestor of yours defeated the last Peveril heir in formal magical combat, and under the old laws of that house, all rights and titles passed to the victor's line." Sharpclaw looked at him steadily. "You own the Deathly Hallows." At the staff table, Dumbledore sat down slowly into his chair. "All three?" Harry asked. "All three," said Sharpclaw. "Though one of them has been in someone else's possession for some decades. We will be addressing that." He cleared his throat, which was not exactly a throat clearing so much as a signal that he was moving on. "Now, the inheritance test also reveals magical restrictions, bindings, and external modifications to your core. Do you want me to read those results aloud or privately?" "Aloud," Harry said. The hat already said it out loud. "Everyone already knows there were 89 memory charms." "The test," said Sharpclaw, with a careful quality, "identifies the nature of those charms. Some of this may be difficult to hear." "I know," Harry said. "Aloud." Sharpclaw looked at him for one long moment with those ancient bronze eyes. Then he nodded, once, and turned to address the hall the way a barrister addresses a courtroom. "The inheritance test has identified the following on the person of Harrison James Potter Black Peveril Gryffindor, age 11 years, 2 months, first. 89 memory charms, as identified by the sorting hat, cast between the ages of approximately 18 months and 9 years. The magical signatures on these charms belong to a minimum of 3 distinct casters, 2 of which are identifiable as ministry-registered wand signatures." He paused. "Second. 1 magical loyalty suppressor, placed on the core at approximately age 15 months, designed to prevent the formation of bonds of absolute magical loyalty, the kind that would alert bonded parties to the wearer's distress. Third. 1 magical power limiter, placed on the core at approximately 18 months, functioning at a ratio of approximately 40% suppression, meaning Harry Potter has been operating, for his entire magical life, at 60% of his actual capacity." He let that sit for a moment. Fourth. 1 compulsion weave, minor in classification but consistent in application, designed to increase susceptibility to authority figures and decrease the subject's natural inclination to question instructions given by persons in positions of institutional power. The quiet that followed was the kind that follows things that can't be untaken. McGonagall's voice came clearly and steadily from the staff table, and what it said was, "Albus." Dumbledore said nothing. "The charms," said Sharpclaw, "are not all of equal age or identical signature. Some were clearly applied in early childhood. Several were applied between ages 5 and 7. A cluster of 17 were applied within the last 18 months. He looked at the list. The most recent one was applied approximately 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks ago. Harry had been at the Dursleys 4 weeks ago. He'd been at the Dursleys every week for his entire life. He turned and looked at Dumbledore. The headmaster met his gaze, and whatever Harry had expected to find there, guilt, calculation, the careful composure of a man managing a narrative, what he actually found was something more unsettling than any of those things. He found the expression of a man who believed, completely and without apparent doubt, that what he had done had been the right thing to do. Not someone who'd been caught doing something wrong and knew it. Someone who had been caught doing something they still believed was justified. That was worse, somehow. Harry filed that away. Under Goblin law, Sharpclaw continued, and now his voice had acquired a formal cadence that turned the Great Hall into something resembling a court. The placement of power limiters and compulsion weaves upon a magical heir without the consent of that heir's magically recognized guardian constitutes a Class 1 violation of heir rights, carrying penalties including but not limited to full reversal of all modifications, full access to suppressed assets and accounts, punitive seizure of assets belonging to the responsible parties, and referral to the Wiesengemot for criminal prosecution. He closed the parchment. As of this moment, all modifications identified by this test are hereby dissolved, pending only the physical reversal process, which will be conducted at Gringotts. He looked at Harry with something that wasn't quite warmth but was something adjacent to it, the respect of one party recognizing in another the capacity for clarity under pressure. "Do you understand what this means, Potter?" "It means," Harry said, "that I'm about to find out what I actually am." Sharpclaw nodded. "Yes. And whoever did this is in trouble." "Considerable trouble," agreed Sharpclaw, and this time there was no mistaking it. The goblin was close to satisfied, the way a very controlled person shows satisfaction, which is barely at all. Gringotts does not look favorably upon violations of heir rights. Gringotts has, in the past, called in entire outstanding debts of the wizarding world over lesser insults. You have houses to your name. You have vaults. You have rights that have been actively suppressed and assets that have been actively redirected. He closed his case. "The bank is interested, Mr. Potter. The bank is very interested." "I want to see the vaults," Harry said. "All of them. Tonight." "That can be arranged." Sharpclaw gestured to the goblin with the case. "We will need to return to Gringotts. The physical removal of the modifications requires our facilities, our curse breakers, and certain equipment we did not bring to a school feast." He said school feast in a tone that communicated exactly how much the concept of a school feast featured in Gringotts' priorities, which was not at all. "The process will take several hours. We can return you to Hogwarts by morning." "He's 11, said McGonagall sharply. "He is not leaving this school without he is a lord of 3 houses, said Sharpclaw, without heat. "Under wizarding law as well as goblin law, that confers emancipation. He may make his own decisions." He looked at McGonagall with an expression of precise neutrality. "Unless someone would like to dispute his lordship claim? We can begin the challenge proceedings and have them resolved in approximately 6 to 8 months of legal wrangling, if you'd prefer." McGonagall said nothing. "McGonagall," Harry said, and she looked at him with that same recalibrated attention she'd given him before. "Can you come with me? I think I'd like someone from the school." He considered. "Someone I can trust." The word trust hung in the air between them like a question. McGonagall's jaw was tight and her eyes were bright and she was, Harry understood, furious, not at him, but in that adjacent to him way that adults were furious when something had been done to a child in their care without their knowledge, the fury of someone whose protection had been circumvented. She looked at Dumbledore once, a look that contained multitudes, and then she looked back at Harry and said, "Yes. I'll come." "Can I come?" said Ron, from the floor. "Ron," said Harry. "I'm just saying, you've been my mate for about 10 hours and this is the most interesting thing that's ever happened and I'm just, yeah, all right, I see the look you're giving me." "I'll tell you everything when I get back," Harry promised. Ron appeared to weigh this offer. "You'd better," he said, then paused. "Also, Gryffindor Peveril, you own the invisibility cloak, you know. Dad mentioned the Peveril line once." "That's the cloak." Harry looked at him. "How do you know about the, Dad works at the ministry. He knows about everything." Ron grinned. "Good luck." Harry stood up from the floor, brushed off the back of his trousers with a practicality that suggested he'd spent a lot of time on floors, and looked at Sharpclaw. "Let's go," he said. As he walked toward the doors of the great hall, McGonagall at his side, the three goblins falling into step with the smooth efficiency of people executing a known protocol, Harry was aware of the hall watching him. 400 people. The teachers. Dumbledore, still seated, still with that expression of a man who believed in his own righteousness. At the door, Harry stopped. He turned back, and he found Dumbledore's eyes across the length of the hall, and he looked at him the way you look at a problem you intend to solve, and he held it for 3 seconds, and then he went through the doors. Behind him, the Sorting Hat said, in a voice that filled the hall with the weight of a thing 4 centuries old and deeply, deeply angry, "The feast may proceed. But what has been spoken here tonight is sealed into the protocol record, witnessed by 442 persons, and cannot be unmade." A pause. Someone made choices. Someone will answer for them. That is not a threat. That is simply how things work. The doors swung shut. The night air outside the castle was cold and clear and smelled of the lake, and Harry stood on the steps for exactly 2 seconds to breathe it in, this cold, honest Scottish air that had no memory charms in it, that didn't belong to the Dursleys or to anyone who decided what he should and shouldn't know, and then he walked down toward the waiting carriages, and the goblins, and whatever was waiting at Gringotts. McGonagall walked beside him, and after a moment she said, quietly, "Harry." "Yeah." "I didn't know," she said. Harry believed her. He believed her the way he believed the air and the lake and the cold, completely, without having to think about it. "I know," he said. She said nothing else, but she walked a little closer, close enough that her robes brushed his shoulder, and Harry thought that was probably her version of the thing she wanted to say and couldn't fit into words, and that was fine. He didn't need words for it. The carriages were waiting at the bottom of the steps. Sharpclaw spoke a word in gobbledygook and a second set of carriages appeared from nowhere, sleek, black, low to the ground, with bronze fittings and the Gringotts insignia on the doors. Harry climbed in. The carriage moved. He was going to find out who he was. It had taken 11 years and 89 memory charms to hide it from him, and whatever was waiting in those vaults, whatever name he actually carried, whatever power had been sitting at 60% efficiency in his core for his entire life, he was going to find all of it. He wasn't angry yet. Anger was for later, when he knew what he was angry about. Right now there was just the carriage, and the night, and the road to Gringotts, and the clean, uncomplicated feeling of a door being opened. He looked out the window at the Scottish darkness rushing past and thought, let's see, then. Chapter 2. The weight of gold. Gringotts at night was a different creature entirely from Gringotts in daylight. During the day it was all marble columns and sunlight through high windows and the orderly chaos of transactions, wizards clutching money bags, goblins behind counters moving with the clipped efficiency of people who found humans mildly tolerable at best. It had the quality of a very serious bank doing very serious banking. At night, the marble was lit from sources Harry couldn't identify, a cool blue-white that made the stone look like it was lit from the inside, like moonlight had been trapped in it. The counters were unmanned but not empty, there were goblins moving through the space, but purposefully, in the way of a building that never entirely slept. The ceilings were higher than he remembered, or maybe they just seemed higher without crowds to cut the scale down. The chandeliers were dim but present. The silence had weight. Sharpclaw moved through the entrance hall without pausing, and Harry and McGonagall followed. 2 goblins at the inner doors straightened when they saw Sharpclaw and opened them without being asked. "The vault levels are below," Sharpclaw said, as they passed through into a corridor that sloped downward. The air cooled immediately. "But the curse-breaking suite is on the 3rd sublevel. We'll go there first. The modifications need to come off before we access anything. Attempting vault entry with a suppressed core occasionally triggers a backlash. Unpleasant for everyone. What does removing them feel like?" Harry asked. Sharpclaw considered this with the manner of someone who was genuinely trying to give an accurate answer rather than a reassuring one. The limiter removal feels like a pressure release. Sudden, significant. You may feel overwhelming. The compulsion weave is more uncomfortable, woven spells don't like coming off. Brief headache. 2 minutes, not more. He glanced sideways at Harry as they descended. The memory charm removal is a longer process. We won't do them all tonight. The deeper ones need a specialist, a goblin memory weaver. Tonight we'll clear the surface layers and set the framework. Full removal will take 3 to 4 sessions. The ones from 4 weeks ago, Harry said. Can those come off tonight? Sharpclaw looked at him. Yes. Then do those first. McGonagall made a sound that was too controlled to be a gasp but was adjacent to one. The curse-breaking suite was a room that looked like the somewhere between a surgery and a library, long stone table in the center, shelves of carefully labeled vials and instruments along the walls, runes carved into the floor in a circular pattern that glowed faintly amber. 3 goblins were already there when they arrived, and they moved when Sharpclaw entered with the specific, responsive efficiency of people who'd been briefed and were prepared. Up, said Sharpclaw, gesturing at the table. Harry sat on it. The stone was cold even through his robes. McGonagall stood at the edge of the room with her hands clasped in front of her and her face composed in the precise way it composed itself when she was not going to let her feelings interfere with what needed doing, but the feelings were there. One of the goblins, female, with clever hands and a collection of instruments that she laid out on a side table with a jeweler's care, approached Harry and said, without preamble, I am Copperthread. I will conduct the primary removal. Do not move. If something feels wrong, say so immediately. Do not try to manage discomfort silently, it gives me inaccurate feedback. She looked at him with the direct, no-nonsense gaze of someone who'd said this speech 100 times and still meant every word of it. Understood? Yes, said Harry. Good. She raised her hands, she worked without a wand, her fingers tracing patterns in the air above Harry's head with the focus of someone who could feel the magic as she moved through it. I can see the suppressor clearly. Old work. Not goblin, human. Reasonably precise for human work, which is to say not very precise at all. It'll come off cleanly. She paused. The compulsion weave is Messier. Whoever did this one was working in a hurry, or is not very skilled, or both. Can you tell who cast it? Harry asked. Copperthread's hands stilled. She tilted her head with a particular quality of attention. The signature is faint at this age. But yes, with time, the inheritance parchment gives us enough of a baseline. We can match. She looked at Sharpclaw. We will, said Sharpclaw, from across the room. Continue. Copperthread said, this will feel strange, and pressed both palms flat against the air approximately 3 inches above Harry's temples. Harry felt it immediately. A pulling sensation, like a thread snagged on something being worked loose, deep and structural, the kind of pulling that isn't painful but is deeply felt. He kept still. The room was quiet except for the low ambient sound of the runes on the floor, which had intensified their glow to a steady pulse. Then Copperthread's hands moved outward in a sharp, decisive gesture, and Harry felt, it was hard to describe. It was like a window opening in a room he hadn't known was stuffy. Like the moment after a headache breaks when you realize how much pressure you'd been carrying and normalized. Like suddenly hearing a frequency that had been just below the range of perception, not new, just accessible. He breathed in and felt his own magic, and it was not the low thrum he was used to but something larger, something that moved through him like weather. Oh, he said. Yes, said Copperthread. He looked at his own hands, which looked exactly the same, but felt the way he looked at them differently, through something cleaner, something sharper, as though the lens he'd been using had been ground wrong and this was the correction. That was the limiter? That was the limiter, she confirmed. 40%, as the test indicated. She paused, and looked at him with an expression that even her professional neutrality couldn't quite flatten. You're registering well above average, now that the restriction is gone. Significantly above. How significantly? McGonagall asked, from the edge of the room. Copperthread looked at her employer's superior with the expression of someone who was choosing their words. The unrestricted core reading puts him in the top percentile of recorded measurements for someone his age. Upper end of that percentile. She said it with the same flat precision she used for everything, but the precision itself was a choice, Harry thought, the choice to say it like a measurement rather than a statement of significance, which was how you delivered a large piece of information in a small room without causing a scene. McGonagall sat down in a chair at the side of the room. The compulsion we've next, Copperthread said, and her hands moved again, and this time it was exactly what she described, uncomfortable, brief, a headache that arrived hard and left fast, like something that had been nailed and being pulled out with one clean motion. Harry's eyes watered briefly and then cleared. Done, said Copperthread. Now the surface memory charms. The ones from the last 18 months. I'll need you to stay completely still for this one. Memory work requires more precision than structural work. Harry lay back on the table and looked up at the stone ceiling of the curse-breaking suite and said, "Ready." What followed was an hour and 15 minutes that Harry would think about for years. The surface memory charms came off in sequence, and each one was different. Some came off like a soap bubble, a brief cold pop and then nothing, and some came off like pulling a sliver of glass out of skin, a bright specific pain with relief immediately behind it. And with each one, something came back. Not dramatic, cinematic flashbacks. More like finding things in the dark. You reach your hand out and touch something you recognize and can name. A conversation. A face. A moment that had happened and then been smoothed over, the way a wave smooths sand. He remembered a letter. Not the Hogwarts letter, an earlier one, a letter that had arrived 2 summers ago that the Dursleys had locked in a box and that someone had then apparently decided was something Harry shouldn't remember receiving. A letter from a solicitor about something to do with his parents' estate. He remembered a woman, not his mother, someone else, a woman with dark hair and a warm voice and a laugh like something being delighted, coming to the Dursleys' house when he was 7 and being turned away at the door by Uncle Vernon, and then remembering being 7 and wondering afterward why he had a feeling something important had happened that day and not being able to place it. He remembered being 5 and doing accidental magic that was large and controlled enough that Petunia had gone white-faced and made a phone call immediately afterward. And then he remembered, and this one arrived not like finding something in the dark but like a light coming on, he remembered Sirius. Not the name Sirius, not a clear face, just the memory shape of someone, a voice, low and warm and with an edge of humor in it even in serious moments, a pair of hands that caught him when he fell off something, the specific safe weight feeling of being carried on someone's shoulders while they walked. The emotional texture of someone who had mattered. Who had been there. "Stop," Harry said. Copperthread's hands stilled instantly. "What is it? Pain?" "No." Harry was staring at the ceiling. "I had someone. Before the Dursleys. There was someone." He turned his head to look at Sharpclaw, who had stationed himself against the wall with his arms folded and the expression of a man who had been waiting for this specific moment. "My godfather." Sharpclaw nodded, once. "Sirius Black," Harry said, and the name came out of somewhere the charms hadn't quite reached, the place where things you know in your bones live rather than things you remember with your mind. "Yes," said Sharpclaw. "He's in Azkaban." "Yes." "Did he?" Harry stopped. He thought about the 7-year-old being carried on shoulders. He thought about the voice with the edge of humor in it. He thought about the way the Dursleys always said Sirius Black's name, when they said it at all, with a specific careful venom, like they were choosing it to do damage. Did he actually do what they said he did? Sharpclaw was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the particular weight of a professional who is choosing to speak beyond their brief because the facts require it. The black account managers have had concerns about the circumstances of Sirius Black's incarceration since it occurred. He was sent to Azkaban without trial. There are questions about the evidence. The bank has interests in the matter, as Sirius Black is the heir to a significant account with us, and his imprisonment without trial or conviction has created legal complications that the Ministry has repeatedly declined to address. He looked at Harry steadily. As the holder of the Potter Lordship, you have legal standing to petition for a formal trial on behalf of a family member. The Potter and Black houses have a long-standing alliance charter. We can discuss the specifics later. Harry lay still for a moment with this information. Then he said, "Continue," to Copperthread, and she continued. By the time she was done with the surface layer, it was past midnight. Harry sat up and felt the room differently than he had an hour ago. It was the same stone ceiling and the same amber runes and the same cool air, but he was sitting in it with more of himself than he'd had before, and that made everything sharper and more present. "The deeper layers will need the specialist," Copperthread said, drying her hands on a cloth with the precise movements of someone putting tools away carefully. 2 more sessions. The ones from infancy are embedded in formative memory structures. Remove them wrong and you take legitimate memories with them. The specialist works slower. "Schedule them," Harry said. "As soon as possible." "Next week," said Copperthread. "I'll send word to your school." McGonagall, who had been very quiet during the removal process, stood up from her chair. Her composure was entirely intact, but Harry had been watching her face for the last hour, which had its own story in it. Each time something had clearly come back to him, she'd had an expression that was the face of someone taking on weight they couldn't put down. "Harry," she said. "Are you ready to see the vaults?" "Yes," Harry said, and got off the table. Sharpclaw led them down. The Gringotts cart system at night had no other carts running, which meant the tunnels were empty and the sounds of their own cart were very loud, the clatter of wheels on track, the rush of air, the occasional screech of a turn taken fast. Harry sat in the front of the cart with Sharpclaw and let the underground wind pull at his hair and tried to organize what he now knew. 89 memory charms. 3 casters minimum, 2 with traceable wand signatures. A power limiter. A compulsion weave. A godfather in Azkaban without a trial. An estate solicitor turned away. A woman turned away from the Dursleys. Houses he'd apparently inherited. Vaults he'd apparently never been shown. He thought about the vault he'd visited this morning with Hagrid. Vault 687, a mid-level vault, decent but not exceptional by wizarding standards, Hagrid had implied. A pile of gold and silver that Harry had looked at with the wonder of someone who'd never had money. He wondered how many vaults there actually were. The cart stopped at a level Harry hadn't seen in the morning, deeper, colder, darker. The vault doors here were not the numbered wooden ones from the upper levels or the reinforced stone ones from the middle levels. They were iron, old enough to have a patina that wasn't corrosion but something else, a depth that came from age and the specific kind of magic that accumulates in things kept and tended for centuries. Sharpclaw stepped out of the cart and walked to the nearest door, which bore no number. What it bore, centered at eye level, was a crest Harry recognized. He didn't know where he recognized it from, but he did. A lion, rampant, over a field of gold, with 3 stars. Potter. "The Potter family vault," said Sharpclaw, "has been in continuous operation at Gringotts for 430 years. The ancestral vault has not been accessed in 9 years and 4 months, since the night of October 31st, 1981. He produced a small iron key from his robes, then looked at Harry. "Your key." "The one Hagrid retrieved this morning was to Vault 687, which is a trust fund vault, a small portion of the Potter estate set aside for your schooling expenses. This is the main vault." Harry took the key. It was heavier than it looked. The door opened to Sharpclaw's hand and Harry's key both, a 2-party system that felt deliberately designed for situations exactly like this one. The stone ground inward and light came out, not the vault lights that blinked on mechanically, but ambient light, as though the vault generated its own, which Harry supposed, after tonight, was entirely possible. He walked in. The first thing was the gold. He'd expected gold. This was a vault. Gold was what vaults had, but the scale of it was something that took a moment to absorb. It was stacked in columns that reached the ceiling, organized by denomination, and the furthest columns were barely visible in the vault's depth, which extended much further back than the entrance suggested. There were jewels organized in cases. There were weapons on wall mounts, not decorative, working weapons, maintained against tarnish by preservation charms. There were books in sealed glass cases along one wall, so many that they were their own library. There were personal items, a woman's jewelry box, several framed portraits whose subjects were currently asleep, a set of boys' toys that were clearly very old, a leather Quidditch case. But it was the portrait that stopped Harry. It hung on the wall facing the entrance, not large, maybe 2 feet by 3, and it showed a man and a woman. The man was slim with untidy dark hair and eyes behind round glasses. The woman had long red hair and green eyes. They were sitting together, and the man had his arm around her shoulders, and she was laughing at something he'd just said, her head turned toward him. They were clearly his parents. And this portrait wasn't sleeping, the way the others were. This portrait was watching him. Both subjects were awake, and still, and looking at him with an expression that was impossible to name. He didn't have the vocabulary for what that expression was. It was James Potter who spoke first, and his voice had the quality of something that had been waiting for a very long time. "Harry," he said. Harry stood in the vault doorway for 3 full seconds. He was aware of McGonagall behind him and Sharpclaw at a respectful distance and the weight of every piece of information the night had given him, and he stood there and breathed. "Hi," he said. The woman, his mother, Lily Potter, and looking at her face was like looking in a mirror with a time delay and a gender revision, the same eyes exactly, pressed her hand over her mouth briefly. Then she lowered it, and her voice was steady though her eyes weren't. "You're so tall," she said, which was objectively not true for an 11-year-old, and they both seemed to know it, but it was the kind of thing you say when what you actually want to say is so large it won't fit in a sentence. "Portrait magic," Harry said, carefully. "You're not, you know things that happened up to the night we were killed," said James Potter, with a directness that matched his son's. "The portrait was updated automatically until then. We know what we knew." He was looking at Harry with an expression that was part wonder and part a very quiet fury, and Harry thought he understood the fury because he was beginning to feel it himself. "We know about the memory charms. The vault registered it. There's a monitoring protocol embedded in the Potter family seal. Every time a charm was placed on you, we received a notification." He looked at Harry and his voice changed slightly. "We have received 89 notifications, Harry. We have been sitting in this vault for 9 years receiving notifications and not being able to do a single thing about it." "Who did it?" Harry asked. His father's jaw tightened. "Some of them, we don't know. The earlier ones, the ones from when you were an infant, we have suspicions. The later ones, from the last few years, there are tracks in the seal's record. 2 wand signatures." James looked at him. "One is a ministry official. The other is Albus Dumbledore." McGonagall made a sound. Harry was quiet. He'd been assembling this conclusion since the Sorting Hat had spoken in the Great Hall, and having it confirmed was not a surprise, but there was a difference between assembling a conclusion and hearing it said plainly. One was reasoning. The other was fact. And facts had weight. "I need to know everything the vault record shows," Harry said. "Every notification. Who cast, when, what type. It's documented," Sharpclaw said, from the doorway. "The seal records are bank property and admissible under Wisengamot law as evidence. They will be." He said those last 3 words with the gravity of a promised contract. Harry nodded. He looked back at his parents in the portrait. His mother was watching him with an expression that had the same quality as McGonagall's, the fury of someone whose protection had been circumvented, but filtered through something else, something that was just grief, simple and enormous and contained in the controlled way of people who were managing it because they had to. "You can't talk to me about things you didn't know," Harry said. "It wasn't a question." "No," said his mother. "But we know you. We're a portrait, we've known you since the moment you walked in, the way portraits know. And we know what we knew when we were alive." She looked at him. "You're going to have questions we can answer." "Later," Harry said. "I'll come back." He looked at his father. "I promise." James Potter nodded, and the movement had something in it that wasn't performed or portrait automatic. It was the genuine thing, the nod of a person who's been told something they needed to be told. "We know you will," he said. "We've been watching you for 412 notifications, and waiting wasn't going to work forever. We know you'll come back." Harry turned from the vault. He didn't let himself think too hard about the expression on his mother's face as he turned, because if he did he was going to stop moving, and he couldn't stop yet. He had things to do. He kept moving. "The Black Vault," he said to Sharpclaw. 2 levels down. The Black Vault was everything the Potter Vault was, but with a different character. Where the Potter Vault had warmth, the Black Vault had grandeur, the accumulated weight of a family that had been very powerful for a very long time and had known it. The crest on the door was a basilisk on a field of silver over the Black family motto, which Harry could now read, "Toujours pur." Always pure. Inside, among the stacked wealth and sealed cases, there was a desk. At the desk, in a sealed glass frame, was a letter. Sharpclaw indicated it with a nod. The Black Account Protocol includes a provision for communication from the account holder in the event of incapacitation. Sirius Black filed this prior to his arrest. It was to be delivered to the heir of the Potter estate upon their majority, but given the current circumstances, the bank judges it appropriate to release it now. Harry broke the seal on the frame and took out the letter. The handwriting was fast and slanted and had the quality of someone writing quickly because the thing they needed to say was urgent. "Harry, if you're reading this, something went wrong. A lot of things went wrong, probably, because I'm writing this the night after your parents died and I'm about to go after Peter Pettigrew and I have a feeling about how tonight is going to end. Peter was our secret keeper. Not me. They changed it at the last minute and told almost no one. Peter sold us out. I should have seen it and I didn't, and I'm going to spend a long time not forgiving myself for that. If they lock me up, which they might, because I was there and I was the obvious choice and Peter will have made sure of that, I need you to know that I am innocent and that I loved your parents and I love you, and you are my godson and the last good thing I can think of and I will find a way back to you. Tell the goblins the truth. Tell them everything. They're the only ones with a legal system that isn't run by people who owe Dumbledore favors. I hid something in the vault. 3rd shelf from the left, silver box. It's a memory, a true memory, preserved in goblin glass. It's everything that happened the night your parents died, from my perspective, including my conversation with Peter. Take it to the Wizengamot. Or better yet, take it to the goblins and let the goblins take it to the Wizengamot, because a goblin-sealed memory is harder to dismiss than a human-sealed one. I'm sorry I couldn't protect them. I'm trying to protect you. Padfoot Harry folded the letter. He found the shelf. The silver box. The goblin glass memory inside it, small and bright and preserved like an insect in amber, glowing faintly silver at the edges. He held it carefully and turned to Sharpclaw. "This is evidence," he said. "For a trial. I want to submit it." Sharpclaw looked at the memory with the expression of a professional recognizing a significant piece of documentation. Goblin glass preservation. 9 years old and intact. Yes. That will be accepted. He reached for a containment case from his robes. He had, Harry was beginning to understand, an enormous number of things in his robes, and placed the memory inside it. Submitting a petition for trial to the Waisengemot requires the petitioner to hold legal standing. You hold 3 lordships. You have more than adequate standing. He looked up. Do you want to submit the petition tonight? How do we do that? I send a message to the Waisengemot duty clerk with the petition and the evidence documentation. The duty clerk is required, under law, to accept petitions from lord-rank individuals regardless of hour. A pause. The Waisengemot will be extremely unhappy about receiving this at 1 in the morning. Yes, Harry said. Do it. Gladly, said Sharpclaw, and this time there was no question, the goblin was pleased. They were in the Black Vault for 20 minutes more. Harry walked through it with Sharpclaw pointing out relevant holdings, properties, investments, heirlooms, and Harry filed them away without letting them overwhelm him. Numbers and properties and legal instruments could be sorted later. What mattered right now was the shape of things. He had 3 houses. He had 2 significant vaults plus the trust. He had a godfather who was innocent and locked in Azkaban. He had 89 memory charms and 2 traceable wand signatures and the inheritance test results that the entire Great Hall had just witnessed. He had a portrait of his parents that could answer questions. He had a goblin bank that was, as Sharpclaw had indicated, interested. He climbed back into the cart and rode up through the darkness and thought about what came next. The next chamber they stopped at was not a vault at all. It was Sharpclaw's office, a spare room with a desk of dark wood and 2 chairs and a filing system that occupied one entire wall, organized with a precision that made Hermione's book list look casual. Sharpclaw sat at the desk and produced parchment and wrote with quick, economical strokes, and Harry watched him work, and McGonagall sat in the second chair and was very quiet. McGonagall, Harry said. She looked at him. When we go back to Hogwarts, he said, what happens to Dumbledore? Her face was very still. That depends on what he says. And what do you think he'll say? I think, McGonagall said carefully, that he will tell you he did it to protect you. I think he will believe that. I think he may be right that he believed it. Her voice had the quality of something being said with difficulty, not because it was painful but because she was being accurate, and accuracy in this case required acknowledging complexity she'd rather not acknowledge. Albus has always been very certain that he knows the right thing. That certainty has served us well, many times. And then there are nights like tonight. He placed a compulsion weave on an infant, Harry said. Not angry. Just accurate. McGonagall said nothing. He placed a power limiter on an infant, Harry said. He's been reapplying memory charms on a child for 9 years. Some of them as recently as 4 weeks ago. He paused. He knew about Sirius's imprisonment, which means he knew Sirius never had a trial. He could have demanded a trial at any point. Yes, said McGonagall. Just that. I'm not asking you to choose between us, Harry said. I'm just making sure we're clear on what the facts are. McGonagall looked at him for a long moment, and her expression did something complicated and resolved into something cleaner. The facts, she said, are what they are. And what you've described is a very serious violation of wizarding law and of basic human decency, and she stopped. When she started again her voice was different, not the professor voice but something more human and more furious. I sat in that staff room for 10 years and I argued with him about leaving you at those people's house. I argued with him. He told me it was necessary. He told me there were protections in place. He told me you were fine. The last word came out with a sharp edge on it that she immediately controlled. I should have checked for myself. You didn't know about the charms, Harry said. No. But I should have checked. She said it with the flat finality of someone issuing a verdict against themselves, and Harry recognized that she meant it and that arguing with it would be both useless and wrong. Add it to the list of things I'll deal with, Harry said. The Dursleys. The charms. Sirius. The estate. All of it. He looked at the vault records Sharpclaw had compiled into a neat, terrifying document on the desk. But not all tonight. Sharpclaw finished his writing and looked up. The petition for trial has been sent. He set down his pen. The Wiesengamacht duty clerk has acknowledged receipt. He said the pause around acknowledged receipt in a way that communicated the duty clerk's considerable distress at the hour. A hearing date will be set within 30 days, required by law when a goblin-sealed memory is submitted as evidence. The memory cannot be dismissed, cannot be expunged, and cannot be delayed past the 30-day window without the petitioner's consent. He folded his hands on the desk. Mr. Potter. Harrison. I want to be straightforward with you, because goblin law values directness over political courtesy. Please, said Harry. The bank is acting in accordance with its legal obligations, and our interests align with yours in this matter. Violations of heir rights reflect badly on the bank's ability to protect accounts, and we take that seriously. But what you have uncovered tonight goes beyond a vault management issue. You have documented evidence of multiple criminal acts, you have standing in the Wiesengamacht that many adult lords don't have, and you have just watched several hundred people witness the invocation of a 400-year-old protocol. He paused. What I'm saying is that you are in a position of considerable power, right now, at 11 years old. That position will attract enemies as well as allies. Some of those enemies have been managing your life for the last 9 years and will not respond well to losing that management. He looked at Harry with those bronze eyes that had the quality of seeing through several layers of things. I want to know that you understand what you are walking into. Harry thought about this. Then he said, Sharpclaw. I've been living with people who hated me since I was 15 months old. I've been operating at 60% of my actual magical capacity without knowing what I was missing. I've had 89 memory charms on me and I still managed to make it to 11 years old in a more or less functional state. He held the goblin's gaze. Whatever I'm walking into, I've already survived worse things with less. And I had no information then. Now I have information. He paused. And I have the goblins. Sharpclaw was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, yes. You do. And he almost smiled. The ride back to Hogwarts was grey dawn, the kind of early light that makes everything look clean and possible. The carriages moved through the Scottish landscape with the Highlands on either side turning from black to dark green to something warmer, and birds were beginning to work through the silence, and McGonagall sat across from Harry with the Gringotts documents in a sealed case on her lap. Harry watched the dawn. He thought about his parents' portrait. He thought about the notification system in the vault. We have received 89 notifications, and the image of James and Lily Potter sitting in that vault for 9 years watching notifications arrive and being unable to do anything. He let himself feel that for exactly as long as it took to understand it clearly, and then he set it down. Not away, he wasn't setting it away. Down. Accessible. He knew where it was. He thought about Sirius. A voice, low and warm. Hands catching him when he fell. He thought about the compulsion weave and what it had been doing, decreasing his inclination to question authority. How many times had he accepted something that should have bothered him and hadn't? How many edges had been smoothed off his reaction to things that should have had edges? He couldn't know. He could only know what it felt like now that it was gone, and what it felt like was like having the edges back, clean, precise, useful. He thought about Dumbledore, standing in the Great Hall, choosing not to speak when McGonagall said his name. McGonagall, he said. Yes? When we get back. I want to talk to him this morning. Before classes. Before anything else gets organized around it. She looked at him. Harry, he had a night to prepare something, Harry said. So did I. I'd rather do it before the preparations get elaborate. A pause. McGonagall looked at him with the recalibrated attention she'd been giving him since the Great Hall, and then she nodded. I'll arrange it. Thank you. He paused. Also, I'm apparently in Gryffindor. She looked at him for a moment. The hat said Gryffindor, before it stopped. It had just started to say it. Gryff, he shrugged. The corner of McGonagall's mouth moved. It wasn't a smile exactly, but it was something in the neighborhood of one. Yes, she said. You are. The carriages turned through the Hogwarts gates, and the castle rose above them, all towers and lit windows and the particular ancient stubborn solidity of a place that had been standing for 1,000 years and intended to stand for 1,000 more. Harry climbed out and looked up at it in the early light. Somewhere in there, the first years had been sorted and sent to their dormitories and had probably stayed up half the night talking about what they'd seen. Somewhere in there, Ron Weasley was probably awake and waiting. Somewhere in there, Hermione Granger had probably spent the night with a textbook trying to find every reference to the Founder's Protocol. And somewhere in there, Albus Dumbledore had spent the night deciding what to say. Harry walked through the doors of Hogwarts carrying the weight of a vault's worth of truth and what felt like, for the first time in his life, the full capacity of himself. He was ready for the conversation. Chapter 3. The architecture of lies. The headmaster's office was at the top of a spiral staircase behind a gargoyle that McGonagall moved aside with a word, and climbing it in the early grey morning had the quality of ascending towards something that had been waiting. Harry had slept for exactly none of the night and felt sharpened by it rather than dulled, the way cold sharpens things, clarifies edges. McGonagall knocked once and opened the door without waiting for an answer. Dumbledore was at his desk. He looked like he'd been there all night. The fire was low, the half-moon glasses were in his hand rather than on his face, and the surface of the desk was clear in the way that desks are clear when someone has put things away deliberately rather than not gotten them out. He'd been thinking, not working. Preparing, as Harry had predicted. The office was extraordinary and Harry noted it with the swift peripheral attention of someone who'd learned to read rooms, the portraits of previous headmasters on the walls, most of them awake and watching, the various silver instruments on spindle-legged tables, whirring softly, the pensieve on its stone basin in the alcove, the sword behind glass on the wall. Gryffindor's sword, Harry noted, with the particular interest of someone who now understood what that inscription meant. And on the perch beside the window, a phoenix, watching Harry with eyes like coals, who ruffled his feathers when Harry entered and made a low musical sound. Dumbledore rose when they entered and said, "Harry. Please, sit down." "I'm fine standing," Harry said. A small pause. Dumbledore sat back down slowly, and the portraits on the walls shifted with the particular alertness of witnesses settling in. "Minerva," he said. "I'm staying," McGonagall said, from beside the door. Dumbledore looked at her for a moment with an expression of careful composure, and then he looked at Harry, and Harry looked at him, and neither of them said anything for 3 seconds that felt much longer than 3 seconds. "I imagine," Dumbledore said, "that you have questions." "I have answers," Harry said. "Most of them. What I have are statements, and I'd like you to respond to them." Dumbledore tilted his head, a gesture of benign attentiveness that Harry now read with considerably more skepticism than he would have 12 hours ago. The compulsion weave was gone. His instinct to defer to the figure of authority in the half-moon glasses and the long silver beard was gone with it, replaced by the clean evaluation of a person looking at another person without interference. "The memory charms," Harry said. 89 of them. 2 traceable wand signatures. One is a ministry official. The other is yours. Dumbledore said, "Harry, that's a statement," Harry said. "Not a question. I don't need you to confirm it. The inheritance test results are filed with Gringotts, which means they're legal documentation. I'm just making sure we start from the same place." He held Dumbledore's gaze. "Start from the place where we both know what you did." Something moved behind Dumbledore's eyes. Not guilt, exactly. Harry had been right about that in the Great Hall. It was closer to the expression of a chess player who's watched an opponent make a move that's rearranged the entire board. Recalculation. "I acted," Dumbledore said, in what I believed were your best interests. And in the best interests of the wizarding world. Both at the same time, Harry said. How convenient. McGonagall made a sound. The power limiter, Harry continued. You put it on me at 18 months old. Explain that one. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with the careful tone of a man choosing each word as he placed it, when Voldemort's curse rebounded on him on the night of October 31st, the magical backlash was considerable. You survived it, which should not have been possible. The power that allowed you to survive it, the power that Lily's sacrifice channeled through you, was enormous for an infant to contain. Without the limiter, there was a real possibility of what? Harry said. Of being powerful? Of being unstable, Dumbledore said, and his voice had acquired a gentle quality, the voice of a teacher explaining something difficult to a student. Uncontrolled magical power in an infant is dangerous too. The limiter ran until tonight, Harry said. I'm 11. At what point in the last 9.5 years did the reason you placed it stop being true? Silence. The power limiter was about protecting me from my own magic, Harry said. I understand that argument for 15 months old. I am 11. When did it become about something else? Dumbledore removed his half-moon glasses and held them in his hands, turning them slowly. It was a gesture of thoughtfulness, or a gesture designed to look like thoughtfulness, and Harry wasn't sure anymore which one it was. The night your parents died, Dumbledore said, the prophecy became fully activated. You became the subject of a prophecy that named you as the only person capable of defeating Voldemort. He looked up at Harry. You were 15 months old. I needed to protect you until you were ready. Ready, Harry repeated. There are things in motion that are larger than either of us, Harry. The war with Voldemort, the safety of the wizarding world, I have been managing these things for many decades. I have made decisions that, you decided I should grow up in a cupboard, Harry said. The portraits on the walls were very still. The blood protections, Dumbledore began, could have been anchored to any blood relative. It didn't have to be the Dursleys specifically. There were other options. Harry looked at him. You chose the Dursleys because they would make sure I didn't know what I was. Didn't know what I had. Didn't have anyone to tell me the things you didn't want me to know. He paused. And then when I started to figure things out anyway, when I was old enough to start asking questions, you sent someone to put more charms on me. Dumbledore said nothing. The most recent charm was 4 weeks ago, Harry said. I was leaving for Hogwarts in a month. I was about to come here. Whatever I was going to learn here would have answered questions I was starting to ask. So someone cast a memory charm 4 weeks ago to smooth those questions off. He looked at Dumbledore with absolute steadiness. Was that you or the ministry official? A longer silence. That was, Dumbledore said, very quietly, me. McGonagall's indrawn breath was sharp and audible. Thank you for saying so, Harry said, and he meant it, not graciously, but accurately. The confirmation mattered even when he already knew the answer. It was the difference between assumption and record. Harry, Dumbledore said, and his voice had shifted again, out of the careful measured mode and into something more unguarded, more urgent. What I did was done out of, the things I feared for you were real. Voldemort is not defeated. He will return. When he does, Harry said, he'll be dealing with me at full capacity instead of 60%. Which seems better for everyone. He paused. Except for the people who wanted me manageable. The word landed in the room like a stone in still water, and the ripples from it moved outward and touched every surface, and Dumbledore sat in the center of it and for the first time looked something close to what he was, an old man who had been making decisions about other people's lives for so long that he had stopped distinguishing between what was his to decide and what wasn't. I am not your weapon, Harry said. Not angry. Not loud. Just precise. I understand that there's a prophecy. I understand that Voldemort is a problem. I understand you've been managing this for years and you believed what you were doing was right. But I am not 11 years old because of your management. I am alive in spite of what was done to me, not because of it. And I am going to deal with Voldemort, because there's a prophecy and because he murdered my parents and because it's the right thing, but I will do it as myself. Not as the version of me you built. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. You are very like your father, he said finally, and it came out in a way that was both a compliment and a kind of defeat. Good, Harry said. He turned to McGonagall. I need to sleep for a few hours. Then I have a list of things. Sirius's trial petition was filed last night. Gringotts sent it to the Wizengamot. I need to know when the hearing is scheduled. I need to arrange the second removal session with Copperthread. And I need to talk to my housemates. He paused. What time do classes start? 9 o'clock, McGonagall said, and her voice was very controlled, but the look on her face was the look of someone who had watched something necessary happen and was still processing the shape of it. I have time, Harry said. He walked to the door, and at the door he stopped once and looked back at Dumbledore. The headmaster was sitting in his chair behind the clear desk with the low fire and the watching portraits, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man of extraordinary intelligence and genuine care and genuine wrong, sitting in the specific stillness of someone who has been told something true that they cannot argue with. I don't hate you, Harry said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not doing any of this out of hate. He held Dumbledore's gaze. But there are going to be consequences. Not from me, from the law. Gringotts filed the documentation. The Wizengamot will receive it. I didn't ask them to pursue it quietly, because I don't think it should be quiet. He paused. You should probably talk to a solicitor. He went through the door. The staircase was cool and quiet and he descended it thinking about sleep, which he needed, and Ron, who was probably awake, and the day that was just beginning. Behind him, McGonagall said, from the top of the stairs, Albus. I will be submitting a formal report to the Board of Governors. Dumbledore said nothing, and McGonagall came down the stairs, and by the time she reached the bottom her face was composed and her chin was up and she was the professor she always was, and only the particular brightness in her eyes gave anything away. I'll walk you to Gryffindor Tower, she said. You don't have to, Harry said. I know, she said, and walked with him anyway. The Gryffindor common room at 6 in the morning had the chaotic, warm quality of a place that had been awake all night. When Harry pushed through the portrait hole, McGonagall had given him the password at the bottom of the stairs. He was met immediately with noise, which resolved into voices, which resolved into Ron Weasley standing up from the sofa closest to the fire with the expression of someone who had been waiting and was done waiting. You're back, Ron said. I'm back, Harry confirmed. Right. Good. Ron sat back down and pulled his legs up and looked at Harry with that direct, uncomplicated attention that Harry had noticed on the train and liked immediately. How was it? Eventful, Harry said, dropping into the chair across from him. Give me the version with all the good bits left in. Harry looked around the common room. There were first years in clusters on every surface. Fred and George had apparently stayed up with the younger students, sitting on the floor with their legs stretched out, looking at Harry with bright, identical, very awake expressions. The girl with the dark hair who'd sat down on the floor of the great hall, Parvati Patil, Harry would learn her name in the morning, was asleep on one sofa. Neville Longbottom was awake, sitting in the corner with his arms wrapped around his knees, and he met Harry's eyes with a particular careful attention that was different from everyone else's, more personal somehow. Hermione was at the table by the window, and she had a stack of 3 books open and a parchment covered in notes, and she was looking at Harry with an expression that suggested she had been doing research and had found things and the things needed to be said. Hermione's going to explode, Ron said, with the affectionate pragmatism of someone who had been watching this build for hours. I can hear you, Ron, Hermione said. I know, said Ron. Harry looked at Hermione. What did you find? She gathered her parchment and crossed the room and sat on the edge of the chair nearest Harry and said, without preamble, "The Founder's Protocol is real, obviously, we saw it, but I wanted to confirm the details. Article 3 has only been invoked 3 times in Hogwarts history. Twice in the 1400s and once in 1563, and in all 3 cases it was children who had been placed under compulsion charms by family members for inheritance reasons." She looked at her notes. "The Peveril line inheritance, you own the 3 artifacts, which are the Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, and the Cloak of Invisibility. Ron's right that the cloak is in your family. The invisibility cloak that passes through the Potter line is confirmed as the genuine Peveril artifact in several historical texts." She looked up. "The Elder Wand is currently with Dumbledore. He took it from Grindelwald in 1945. The common room was very quiet now. Everyone was listening. "He has one of my family's artifacts," Harry said. "Under conquest rights, it's legally yours," Hermione said, and she said it with the specific energy of someone who has found something in a book that disturbs them but they're going to say it clearly because clarity matters. "The Wisengamot Code from 1689 is ambiguous about inherited conquest claims, but the older precedents, and Goblin law, which takes precedence in matters of direct inheritance under the Gringotts Charter of 1752, are clear. If the inheritance test recorded it as yours, it's yours." "Something else to add to the list," Harry said. "There's more," said Hermione. Harry gestured for her to continue. "I looked up the Wisengamot composition, who holds seats, who votes on what. You have seats. 3 of them, technically, 1 for each house, though the Potter and Peveril seats have been in abeyance because there was no Lord of Age to fill them. They're not filled until you're 17, but you can proxy vote through Gringotts until then, which is unusual but legal. What that means is," she paused. "Do you know how the wizarding legal system works?" "Broadly," Harry said. "Mostly from what Sharpclaw told me tonight. The Wisengamot is both court and government. It votes on laws and it decides criminal cases. The Chief Warlock presides over it." She looked at her notes. "Dumbledore is the Chief Warlock." Silence. "He presides over the court that will hear the evidence of what he did," Harry said. "Yes," said Hermione. "And he also presided over, or should have presided over, Sirius Black's incarceration. A Chief Warlock is required to ensure all prisoners receive trial within 90 days of arrest. Sirius has been in Azkaban for 9 years without trial, which means the Chief Warlock failed in his legal duty." She held Harry's gaze. "That's separate from the memory charms. That's a dereliction of a specific legal obligation." Fred Weasley said, from the floor, "Bloody hell." "Language," said Hermione, reflexively. "Hermione," said George, "I think language is the least of the problems in this room right now." Harry looked at Neville. The round-faced boy had been very still throughout this conversation, and there was something in his expression, not excitement, not the wide-eyed avidity of the others, but something quieter and more personal, like someone recognizing a pattern in another person's story that they knew from their own. "Neville," Harry said. "You okay?" Neville blinked. Yes. It's just," he stopped. Then he seemed to make a decision, the way you can see someone make a decision in their face, the shift from uncertain to committed. "The Sorting Hat was inside my head for almost a minute," he said. "I thought it was just because it couldn't decide. But now I'm wondering if it found something and decided not to say anything because I wasn't, because I'm not." He swallowed. "My gran always said I didn't have much power. That I took after my dad's non-magical side. That I needed to work twice as hard as everyone else." Harry looked at him. "Did anyone ever test your core?" Neville shook his head. "We should test your core," Harry said. "I don't, Neville." Harry leaned forward slightly. "The Sorting Hat was in your head for a minute. It sorted me in less than that, and I had 89 memory charms on me. What do you think a minute means?" Neville sat very still with this thought. Sharpclaw gave me a contact card, Harry said. I'm going to write to him this morning. I'll ask him to flag your case. He paused. Who has legal guardianship over you? My gran. Augusta Longbottom. Is she kind to you? Neville's expression did something complicated. She loves me, he said, after a moment. She wanted me to be like my dad. My dad was brilliant, apparently. And I'm not. He stopped again. She gave me his wand. It never worked properly for me. She said I just needed to practice more. Harry thought about a wand that didn't fit its wielder. He thought about what Ollivander had said, the wand chooses the wizard, and he thought about what it would mean to use a wand that had chosen someone else for your entire life, and what that would do to your assessment of your own abilities. Ron, he said. Yeah? What's the name of that wand maker, the one in Diagon Alley? Ollivander. Is there anyone else? Any other wand makers? Gregorovitch, in Eastern Europe. And there's a woman, Violetta something, in Edinburgh, she does custom work, Mums mentioned her. Ron looked at Neville. Neville, mate, if you've been using Frank Longbottom's wand your whole life, it was his wand, Neville said, and there was a thread of defensiveness in it that was clearly reflexive, the defensiveness of someone who's been told a story about themselves for so long that they protect it even when the story isn't serving them. It was, Harry said. And you deserve your own. The fire crackled. Outside the common room windows, the dawn had fully arrived, pale and gold through the Scottish clouds. Hermione was watching Harry with her most analytical expression. Harry, she said. When the hat said you were Gryffindor, and you said it started to sort you before it stopped, what were you thinking about? Before it found the charms? Harry considered this. The castle, he said. Just the castle. I was looking up at it and thinking it was the first place that had ever felt like it might be mine. He paused. And about the family I didn't have. Hermione wrote something on her parchment. Harry didn't ask what. Right, said Harry. He stood up. I need to sleep. 2 hours. Then we have classes and I need to write to Sharpclaw and I need to find out when the Wisengamot hearing is. He looked at the room. If anyone asks you about last night, and they will, you can tell them what you saw. I'm not keeping any of this quiet. The more people who know, the harder it is to manage. Fred said, you sound like you've done this before. I've been managed my entire life by people who relied on me not knowing things, Harry said. The most effective thing they had was silence. So no silence. He went to bed. He slept for 2 hours and 11 minutes, and then he was awake, fully and immediately, the way he'd learned to wake at the Dursleys where you had to be alert fast. He lay in the four-poster bed in the red and gold dormitory and listened to Ron sleeping in the next bed and Percy Weasley, he'd learned Percy's name at some point in the evening, snoring with genteel precision in the far bed, and he looked at the canopy above him and thought about the portrait in the vault. His mother's eyes. His father's untidy hair. We have received 89 notifications. He got up and dressed and went down to the common room, which was empty now, the fire banked low, the morning coming clearly through the windows. He sat at the table Hermione had used and took out parchment and quill and ink and wrote 3 letters. The first was to Sharpclaw. He outlined what he discussed with Hermione about Neville, asked for a review of the Longbottom account records, and asked for an update on the Wisengamot hearing timeline. He also asked, carefully, about the ministry official whose wand signature was on the memory charms. He wanted a name. The second letter was harder. He sat with the blank parchment for a while, quill in hand, thinking about a voice low and warm and hands that caught you when you fell. Then he wrote, Sirius, I know this letter is going to Azkaban and I don't know what state you're in or if you'll be able to read it properly. So I'm going to be brief and clear. I went to Gringotts last night. I found your letter in the Black Vault. I submitted your memory as evidence to the Wisengamot. A hearing has been petitioned. Under law they have 30 days to schedule it. You didn't do it. I know you didn't do it. I don't know Peter Pettigrew, but I know you, or I know the part of you I remembered when the surface memory charms came off, and I know. Hold on. It won't be 30 days before things change. Harry, the third letter was to the Wisengamot clerk, formally requesting notification of the hearing date under Lord Potter's right of petitioner's privilege. He sent all three via the school owls, which he found by following the sound of feathers and smell of wind upward through a tower he hadn't been to before. Hedwig, his white owl from Diagon Alley, found him while he was there and landed on his arm and looked at him with amber eyes that had the quality of demanding an account of what had been happening. A lot, he told her. I'll tell you later. She nipped his finger with a quality of affectionate reproach and took his letters and launched herself into the morning. He had 20 minutes before breakfast. He spent them walking. Hogwarts was extraordinary in a way that had nothing to do with the magic, though it was full of magic. It was extraordinary in the way that old things that have been used and loved for centuries are extraordinary, the worn quality of the stone stairs, the particular weight of the portraits watching, the sense of it having housed 10,000 stories before his and intending to house 10,000 more. He walked corridors that twisted unexpectedly, found staircases that were definitely not in the same place he'd seen them a moment ago, past doors that hummed with the low-frequency presence of something important behind them. In a corridor on the third floor, he found Neville. Neville was standing outside a locked door with a determined expression that had clearly replaced a frightened one recently, the freshness of the replacement still visible. He was holding his wand, his father's wand, and looking at the door like he was having a conversation with himself about it. Neville, Harry said. Neville turned. Harry. I wasn't, I was just, it's fine, Harry said. He leaned against the wall across from the locked door. What's in there? I don't know, Neville said. But the corridor's supposed to be off limits. I heard some of the older students talking about it on the train. He paused. I kept thinking about it. That's Gryffindor instinct, Harry said. Terrible judgment, but committed to it. Neville almost smiled. My gran says Gryffindors are reckless. Probably true. Harry looked at the door. We'll leave it for now. Sharpclaw is going to look into your account records, I wrote to him this morning. If there's something on your core, we'll find it. Neville looked at his father's wand. Gran gave it to me when I was 8, he said, more quietly. I think she wanted me to feel connected to him. They did things to him. My parents. They're in St. Mungo's. They've been there since before I can remember. He said it with the particular flatness of someone who has said the fact so many times it has lost its texture, but the texture was there underneath if you pressed. Voldemort's followers used the Cruciatus curse on them until they couldn't come back. Harry was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it with the directness of someone who had also lost parents to Voldemort's reach and didn't need to make it bigger than it was to make it real. Neville nodded. Gran blames herself for not protecting them. I think the wand was about that. About wanting to give me something of his. He turned the wand over in his hands. But it doesn't work right. I know it doesn't work right. I didn't want to say that to her. When I get my own wand situation sorted, Harry said, I'll go with you to get one. If you want. He paused. I think a wand that actually belongs to you might change a lot of things. Neville looked at him with an expression that was unguarded enough to be telling, the face of someone being offered something they'd wanted without knowing how to ask. Okay, he said. They walked down to breakfast together, and by the time they reached the Great Hall the morning had fully broken and the tables were filling and the smell of bacon and eggs and toast was real and present and slightly restorative, and Harry sat down at the Gryffindor table and piled his plate with the focused attention of someone who had been awake all night and running on empty and was fixing that immediately. The hall felt different this morning. Not dramatically, nothing was overtly different, but there was a quality to the attention it paid him that had shifted. Yesterday it had been the wondering look given to the famous boy who lived, the celebrity attention that he'd found uncomfortable in a low-grade ambient way. Today it was something else. More complex. More specific. The students weren't looking at his scar, they were looking at him, at his face, at the way he moved and sat and spoke, and the quality of the look was the look of people recalibrating. He'd walked into a sorting hall as Harry Potter, the boy who lived, a story. He was walking into breakfast as someone considerably more complicated, and people were adjusting their picture. Ron sat down with his own loaded plate and said, without ceremony, "Percy says the Board of Governors received a communication this morning. From McGonagall." He heard it from. Percy shouldn't eavesdrop, Harry said. Percy absolutely should eavesdrop, said Fred, sitting across from him. It's his best quality. He heard it from a portrait, George clarified. A portrait in the corridor outside McGonagall's office. The portraits talk to Percy because he's head boy. Well, he will be in a few years. No, wait, he's a prefect. Point is, he's the kind of student portraits like. What did the communication say? Harry asked. Apparently she's filed for a formal inquiry into the headmaster's conduct, Fred said, at a volume that was, Harry noted, not quite quiet enough to not be overheard by the 3 students nearest them. This seemed intentional. Under the board's oversight charter. Serious stuff. Harry ate his toast. Hermione arrived with Parvati, sat across from him, opened a book, and then said to the book, "I found something else." "Tell me," Harry said. The Gryffindor founder line. "You're a descendant through the female line, that means there's been a witch in every generation carrying the Gryffindor blood. That's not unusual, but what is unusual is that the founder line comes with a Hogwarts charter right. A founder's descendant has the legal right to address the Hogwarts Board of Governors directly, without going through the headmaster. It bypasses the normal chain." She looked up from her book. "It's never been used. The right exists, it's in the charter, but no founder's descendant has been at Hogwarts and publicly identified as such for centuries." She held his gaze. "You could speak directly to the board. About anything. They'd have to listen." Harry considered this. "That's useful. It also means," Hermione said carefully, "that the inquiry McGonagall filed might go differently than it would normally. Boards of governors are usually reluctant to move against a sitting headmaster because they're dependent on his cooperation. But if a founder's heir publicly supports the inquiry, the board moves," Harry said. "Yes." Hermione paused. "Harry. How are you approaching this? I want to understand your strategy." Harry looked at her. He thought she was probably, in the long run, going to be the best ally he had, not because of her loyalty. Ron's loyalty was equally genuine, but because of how her mind worked. She asked about strategy. She'd spent the night reading instead of sleeping because she needed to understand the system before she could operate in it, and that was the mind of someone who was going to be extremely useful. "I'm not trying to destroy Dumbledore," Harry said. "I want to be clear about that. He's useful. He has genuine power and genuine knowledge, and I'm going to need both of those things when Voldemort comes back properly." He paused. "What I'm doing is making sure he knows he can't manage me. There's a difference between an ally who respects you and an asset who obeys you, and I'm not being an asset for anyone." Hermione wrote something on her parchment, which was apparently a response she was taking seriously rather than dismissing as strategy talk. Then she said, "The other thing I found. The wand signature in the memory charms. The ministry official." She glanced around the table, then lowered her voice to a level that could still be heard by Ron but not by the Slytherin table across the hall. "I can't identify it from what we have. The Gringotts documentation will have a name, but it hasn't been made public yet. But based on the timing of when specific clusters of charms were cast," she pointed to a section in her notes. "There are 4 charms cast in the summer of 1988. That overlaps with a specific ministry initiative to locate and register orphaned or unguarded magical children. It would have given someone with access to those records both the reason and the opportunity to visit Privet Drive. Who ran that initiative? Harry asked. I don't know yet, Hermione said. But I can find out. The ministry publishes all its departmental reports. They're in the library. Restricted section, probably, but I'll sign a permission slip, said a voice behind Harry. He turned. McGonagall was standing behind the bench with a cup of tea and the morning air of having already done several things that needed doing. She looked at Hermione's notes and then at Harry and said, "The restricted section access is granted on my authority for any research related to the protocol invocation. I'll have a note on your desk by this afternoon." "Thank you, Professor," Hermione said, with the specific radiant gratitude of someone being given library access. McGonagall looked at Harry. "The board acknowledged my communication this morning. They've scheduled an emergency meeting for Friday. You'll be asked to attend." She paused. "In your capacity as Founder's heir, you may bring a representative." One person. Harry thought for less than a second. Sharp Claw. McGonagall blinked. "From Gringotts? He's a legal representative and he has the full documentation. He can speak to the inheritance test results in a way I can't, because I was on the table when they were happening." McGonagall looked at him with that look again, the recalibrated look. Then she nodded. "I'll communicate that to the board." She started to move away, then paused. "First class is Transfiguration. Try to get there on time." "A beat. Given the night you've had, I'm prepared to consider on time as a flexible concept." She left. Harry went back to his breakfast. 2 tables over, at the Slytherin table, a blonde boy was watching him. Harry had noticed him in the entrance hall the night before, had noticed him again on the boat across the lake, had noticed him in the cluster of first years because he had the quality of someone who noticed being noticed and performed for it. Draco Malfoy. He'd introduced himself on the train with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to their name opening doors, and Harry, who had at that point had the full suite of modifications running, had still found something slightly grating about the entitlement of the handshake. Now Draco Malfoy was looking at him with an expression that had something calculating in it that was too old for an 11-year-old's face, and Harry looked back with the equanimity of someone who had nothing to calculate against because they'd already calculated everything and were simply watching. After a moment, Draco looked away. Harry went back to his eggs. The morning's classes proceeded with the specific quality of a day that has already had its dramatic event and is now doing the practical work of being ordinary. Transfiguration with McGonagall was the first, and it was immediately clear that McGonagall taught the way she did everything, with exacting precision, zero tolerance for sloppiness, and the sharp satisfaction of someone who loved their subject and would take no pleasure in students who didn't meet it adequately. She turned her desk into a pig at the start of class and back again, and Harry watched the magic with his new, unrestricted attention and felt it in a way he hadn't felt anything magical before, not just observed but resonant, like a note played near a tuned instrument. When they were given matches and told to begin transfiguring them to needles, Harry set his hand flat on the desk with the match on his palm and felt the magic move differently than it had this morning at breakfast, differently than it had ever moved before, and the match turned silver and sharp and pointed before he'd consciously decided to complete the process. McGonagall was beside him in 3 steps. She picked up the needle and examined it and set it down and looked at him. "Good," she said, with the specific restraint of a professor who was not going to make a scene about it in class. The restraint itself communicated something larger than praise would have. At lunch, an owl arrived. It was large and official-looking, with the Gringotts seal on the letter, and it caused the Gryffindor table to go quiet in that rolling wave fashion as people noticed it and their conversation died. Harry opened it. Sharpclaw's writing was the same as his manner, precise, economical, no word used that wasn't load-bearing. Harrison, Wisengamot hearing scheduled, October 14th, duty clerk noted the submission under protest. The protest is noted in the record, which is useful to us. Re. Longbottom, Neville. Account review conducted this morning on an expedited basis given the cross-reference to your protocol filing. Findings: magical binding present, placed at age 3, classification, loyalty suppressor and mild power dampener. Not as extensive as yours. Different caster. The signature belongs to a known private curse worker employed historically by the Longbottom family. Re. Ministry official. Name confirmed, Dolores Jane Umbridge, Senior Undersecretary to the Minister for Magic. Her wand signature matches charms cast on you in 1984, 1987, and 1988. The 1988 cluster aligns with her departmental work as documented in ministry records. She is not named in your case alone. Cross-referencing reveals she has accessed at minimum 12 other similar files. We are building a supplementary case. The Elder Wand, formal notice of ownership claim filed with the Wizengamot under Ancient Artifact Recovery Statute. Dumbledore has been notified. He has 30 days to respond. Sharpclaw Harry read the letter twice. Then he passed it to Hermione, who read it and went still. Dolores Umbridge, Hermione said. You know her? I've read about her. She wrote a series of magical creature classification papers that were, she's very political. Very interested in blood status and registration. She's been in the ministry for 20 years. Hermione looked at the letter with an expression that was doing something complicated between fury and analysis. She targeted 12 children. At minimum, Harry said. Ron had leaned across and read the letter over Hermione's shoulder, and his face had gone the particular color of a redhead's face when something has made them angry. 12 kids, he said. And that's what's in the documentation, Harry said. Sharpclaw said cross-referencing. There may be more. What are you going to do about it? Ron asked. Harry looked at the letter. He thought about Sirius Black writing "Tell the goblins the truth" on a piece of paper the night after everyone he loved had died, in the moment before he walked toward what he already seemed to know was coming. He thought about 12 children with memory charms placed by a ministry official with a political agenda. He thought about Dolores Umbridge, Senior Undersecretary, and what kind of person chose to cast memory charms on children. Let Sharpclaw build the supplementary case, he said. Let the documentation accumulate. And then, when the Wizengamot hearing happens, he folded the letter. Don't show up with one crime. Show up with everything. Neville, who had been quiet through the reading and the conversation, said suddenly, They put a binding on me at 3 years old. Yes, Harry said. Neville looked down at his father's wand. He set it on the table. He looked at his hands. Can Copperthread remove it? The goblin at Gringotts? I'll write to Sharpclaw this afternoon, Harry said. We'll schedule it with my second session. My gran, Neville said. She won't, she'll be angry. She might be, Harry said. She might also be relieved. People who make decisions about children out of fear sometimes don't know how to stop being afraid without help. He paused. Either way, it's your core and your magic and you're right. Not hers to decide. Neville looked up. Something in his face had changed, not dramatically, not the sudden transformation of a person who'd been given a revelation, but the quiet settling of a person who'd been told something they already knew and needed to hear from outside their own head. Okay, he said. The afternoon passed with charms and history of magic and the slow organizational chaos of 11-year-olds learning where everything was. Harry moved through it with the new clarity of his unrestricted core, feeling magic the way you feel a restored limb, the same but more, present in a way that kept arriving as a minor surprise. In charms, Flitwick had them attempting Wingardium Leviosa, and Harry, who had been experimentally accessing his magic all day the way you probe a new filling with your tongue, found the feather rising smoothly before the incantation was fully out, and Flitwick made a sound like a small excited bell and wrote something in his notebook with the speed of someone recording something significant. Harry went back to Gryffindor Tower in the late afternoon with the light going gold through the windows and wrote his second letter to Sharpclaw, requesting Neville's appointment. He also sent a shorter note, via the school owl, to the Board of Governors' Administrative Office, formally announcing his attendance at Friday's meeting and the name of his representative. He imagined the board receiving a letter from an 11-year-old formally invoking his right as a founder's heir with a Goblin senior accounts investigator listed as his representative, and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was related to it, the feeling of pieces being placed correctly. By dinner, the castle felt different again. Information had traveled the way information travels in a school, which is to say everywhere at once and at high speed. Everyone knew about the Wisengamot hearing. Everyone knew about the Board of Governors meeting. Several people, apparently, knew about Dolores Umbridge, because Flitwick had made a face in the corridor outside the staff room that several students had seen and interpreted correctly. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy was talking to his housemates with an expression that had lost some of its easy confidence and replaced it with something more careful. Harry noticed without staring, which was a skill he'd developed early. At the staff table, the seat in the center was empty. Dumbledore was not at dinner. After dinner, in the common room, Harry sat by the fire with Ron on one side and Hermione on the other and Neville across from him, and outside the castle the Scottish Knight was doing what Scottish Knights did in September, which was reminding you of winter, and the fire was the uncomplicated good thing in the room. Ron said, into the comfortable quiet, "My dad is going to have so many questions." "I'll write him a summary," Harry said. Ron grinned. "He'd love that. He collects interesting things that happen. He's going to frame this letter." Hermione, who was reading with the focused energy of someone who had been given restricted section access and intended to use every bit of it, said without looking up, "The ministry official, Umbridge. If Sharpclaw is building a case, the ministry is going to find out. They'll try to get ahead of it." "Let them try," Harry said. "The Minister for Magic, Cornelius Fudge, he's generally considered a political animal. He'll distance himself from Umbridge publicly and protect the ministry's reputation privately. He'll probably try to make it look like an isolated incident." "Is that a problem?" Ron asked. "It's a problem if we let the narrative become about one bad ministry official," Hermione said. "Rather than about a systemic willingness to interfere with children's magical rights for political purposes." She set down her book. "Harry, what you have is larger than Umbridge and larger than Dumbledore individually. What you have is evidence that multiple adults in positions of power, from multiple institutions, coordinated, perhaps loosely, perhaps not even consciously as a full coordination, to manage a child's life for strategic reasons. That's not one person's crime. That's a pattern." Harry looked at her across the fire. "You've been thinking about this all day." "I've been thinking about it since the hat spoke in the Great Hall," she said, without apology. "What do you think the pattern is?" Harry asked. "Fear," she said, simply. "They were all afraid of what you might be if you knew what you were. Dumbledore wanted you manageable. Umbridge wanted you documented and controlled because unsupervised magical power in unknown quantities frightens people like her. Whoever placed the loyalty suppressor," she paused. "That's the one I keep coming back to. The loyalty suppressor that was placed when you were 15 months old. Before Dumbledore placed his modifications. Someone put that on you before Dumbledore did. Who was afraid of you before he was? Who knew what you were 15 months after your birth and wanted to make sure you'd never form an absolute magical bond with anyone?" The fire crackled. Harry hadn't been thinking about the loyalty suppressor. He'd been thinking about the memory charms and the power limiter, but the loyalty suppressor, the one placed earliest, at 15 months, before Dumbledore's modifications, by an unknown caster, that was a different thing. That was something placed by someone who knew, at 15 months, that Harry would eventually form bonds strong enough to be worth suppressing. "Voldemort's followers," Ron said, and it wasn't entirely a question. "Maybe," said Harry. "Or someone who knew about the prophecy very early and had access to me before the Potters went into hiding fully." he thought. There was a leak. Peter Pettigrew. What if Peter wasn't the only one feeding information? Hermione wrote it down. Neville said, very quietly, I think the castle knows something's changing. They all looked at him. He nodded at the fire, which had done nothing unusual. He paused. I've been here less than 2 days and it already feels different from anywhere I've ever been. Like it has a personality. He looked slightly embarrassed. That probably sounds stupid. No, said Harry. He thought about walking the corridors in the early morning, the way the castle had felt like a place that had housed 10,000 stories and was making room for his. It doesn't sound stupid at all. Outside, the wind moved across the Scottish Highlands, and the castle stood in it the way it always had, ancient and lit and present, and inside it, around a fire, for first years sat with the weight of tomorrow's work and the knowledge of what had already begun. Chapter 4, Blood and Standing. The Wizengamot chamber was not what Harry had expected. He'd built a picture from Hermione's research, a formal court, stone benches arranged in tiers, the presiding warlock at the center. What he hadn't accounted for was the scale of it, which was enormous in the specific way that institutions build enormous spaces to remind visitors of their own smallness. The ceiling was 50 feet up at least, lit by cold white witch lights that didn't flicker the way candles did but held their brightness with a steady institutional certainty. The benches were arranged in a horseshoe around a central floor that held a single chair, the accused chair, iron-armed, with chains that currently rested quiet and inert, and a standing area for petitioners. It was a Tuesday in October and Harry was 12 days ahead of schedule. The Wizengamot had moved the hearing forward. He wasn't entirely sure whether that was because the goblin-sealed evidence was too significant to sit for a month without creating institutional discomfort, or because enough members had read the Gringotts documentation filing and wanted this resolved before more people read it. Either way, Sharpclaw had sent the notification on a Sunday morning, and by Sunday afternoon Harry was writing to McGonagall, and by Monday morning the logistics were arranged. He sat in the petitioner's gallery with Sharpclaw to his right and McGonagall to his left, and he watched the Wizengamot members file in. There were about 50 of them, in plum-colored robes, and they took their seats with varying degrees of urgency. Some of them looked curious. Some of them looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Several of them looked directly at Harry with expressions that were hard to read from the gallery. The chair at the center of the horseshoe, the chief warlock's chair, was empty when the session opened. Harry noticed that immediately. A witch in her 50s with a severe grey bun stood at the end of the first tier and announced, in the absence of Chief Warlock Dumbledore, who has recused himself from today's proceedings due to his direct interest in the matter before the court, Deputy Chief Warlock Tiberius Ogden will preside. Sharpclaw, beside Harry, made a sound that was quiet and might have been satisfaction. Ogden was a compact man with thick white eyebrows and the expression of someone who had been doing difficult things for a long time and was still doing them. He took the presiding seat without ceremony and looked at the room and said, "We are here on petition by Lord Harry James Potter Black Peverell, requesting formal trial for Sirius Orain Black, incarcerated at Azkaban for 9 years without trial or conviction. Let the petition be read." The witch with the grey bun read it. It was 2 pages of formal language that boiled down to, Sirius Black was sent to Azkaban without following established legal procedure, there is goblin-sealed testimony that casts significant doubt on his guilt, and under the Wizengamot Charter this failure is actionable. It sounded, read aloud in the cold white light of the chamber, even more damning than it had on paper. When she finished, the chamber was very quiet. "The petitioner will speak," said Ogden. Harry stood and walked to the petitioner's floor, and he was aware, in the peripheral way of someone used to being watched, of 50 people turning their attention onto him simultaneously. He was also 11 years old and had been awake since 5 in the morning and was wearing his school robes because he didn't own anything else appropriate, and none of that changed anything. "Sirius Black was arrested the day after my parents died," Harry said. His voice was clear in the chamber because it was a room built for projection and he was standing at its center. He was sent to Azkaban within 48 hours. No trial was scheduled. No hearing was conducted. He spent 9 years in a cell on the basis of an administrative decision made during a period when the ministry was overwhelmed and proper procedure was either overlooked or deliberately bypassed. He paused. The evidence I've submitted is a goblin-glass preserved memory provided by Sirius Black himself, created on the night of his arrest and stored in the Gringotts Black family vault for 9 years. Goblin glass preservation prevents alteration and guarantees temporal authenticity. It cannot be faked, it cannot be modified after sealing, and it is admissible under every version of Wiesengemot evidentiary law that has existed since 1842. A hand went up from the third tier. A heavy-set man with a broad red face that Harry would learn was named Rufus Scrimgeour. The petitioner is 11 years old. Yes, Harry said. Is the court seriously? The petitioner holds 3 confirmed lordships, verified by Gringotts' inheritance test conducted under the Founder's Protocol, Sharpclaw said from the gallery, and his voice in the chamber was the voice of someone who knew the room was built for projection and intended to use every inch of it. Lord Standing confers the right of petition regardless of age. This is not ambiguous under the Wiesengemot Charter, and I would be interested to hear which portion of the Charter the honorable member believes permits him to question the petitioner's standing rather than his argument. Scrimgeour looked at Sharpclaw with the expression of a man who had just realized the ground was less stable than he'd thought. The standing is not in question, Ogden said, with the tone of someone who was going to run a clean proceeding and was telling everyone that clearly at the start so there were no surprises. He looked at Harry. Continue. The memory shows Sirius Black's account of the night of November 1, 1981, Harry said. It shows his arrival at the site where Peter Pettigrew, the actual secret keeper, not Sirius Black, had orchestrated the confrontation. It shows Pettigrew's betrayal and his deliberate choice to fake his own death in a way that maximized the appearance of Sirius Black's guilt. It shows 12 witnesses to Pettigrew's apparent death who could confirm the bodies they saw and the circumstances, and none of those witnesses were asked to testify at a trial because there was no trial. He looked at the room steadily. Peter Pettigrew is alive. He faked his death to avoid being held responsible for what he did. His current whereabouts are unknown, but the memory provides sufficient basis for a full investigation. The chamber made a noise. It wasn't organized noise, it was the collective sound of 50 people processing information and reacting, which was half murmured conversations and half the silence of people who were thinking hard. Scrimgeour had stopped looking at Sharpclaw and was now looking at his own hands. A witch in the second tier, small, older, with sharp eyes, was writing very quickly. Several members were leaning toward each other in the way of people who have things to say that they're going to say later when they're not being watched. Ogden let it run for about 10 seconds and then said, "The court will view the memory." The memory was projected using the chamber's built-in pensieve system, a wide stone basin at the back of the presiding floor that Harry hadn't noticed initially, fed by the vial that Sharpclaw's team had prepared from the Goblin Glass original. It played silently but visibly, visible to all members, and it lasted 14 minutes. Harry had not watched it beforehand. He watched it now. It was dark and chaotic, the night after the First War ended, the streets of London, a young man with long dark hair and a face that was grief-shattered but recognizable, running. The memory had the quality of memory, emotional truth more than visual clarity, but it was clear enough. The confrontation with Pettigrew. The accusation. Pettigrew's face, and the thing on it that was not fear but calculation. The moment Pettigrew's wand moved. The explosion. The scene from above, as the Dementors arrived, a young man standing in a crater, surrounded by dead muggles and the scattered remains of a finger, laughing the laugh of someone who has broken past what they can hold. It was 14 minutes of a terrible night made visible, and when it ended the chamber was silent in a way that was different from the silence of a proceeding. It was the silence of people who had just seen something that couldn't be unseen. Ogden looked at the room. Then he said, very evenly, "Sirius Orain Black will be transferred from Azkaban to the Ministry Holding Facility immediately, pending the formal scheduling of his trial. The transfer is ordered under emergency review, which means it takes effect today." He looked at the grey-bunned witch. "Draft the order." "Today?" said someone in the third tier. "Today," said Ogden. He looked at the member who'd spoken with the white eyebrows and the patience of someone who was not going to repeat himself but would wait for the objection to be withdrawn. The member withdrew it. "The trial will be scheduled within 14 days, Ogden continued. "The Lord Petitioner will be informed of the date. The investigation into Peter Pettigrew's whereabouts will be opened immediately under the jurisdiction of the Order Office." A pause. He looked at a section of the chamber. "Under my oversight, not the minister's. Given the circumstances." He paused again. "Given the circumstances." The "given the circumstances" landed with weight, and Harry understood that it was the closest Ogden was going to come, in a formal proceeding, to saying given that the minister's office appears to have either overlooked or enabled a 9-year miscarriage of justice and I do not intend to have this investigation contaminated. Harry walked back to the petitioner's gallery and sat down. Sharpclaw said, very quietly, beside him, "Better than expected." "Because of the memory," Harry said. "Because of the memory and because Ogden has wanted to clean this particular mess up for years and you've given him the standing to do it." Sharpclaw straightened his robes with the precise movements of a man putting his professional presentation back into order after having used it. "He is not your ally. But his interests align with yours, which is functionally the same thing." "What happens now?" McGonagall asked, from Harry's left. "Now the ministry scrambles," Sharpclaw said, with a quality in his voice that suggested this was not a problem for him. "The documentation filing from Gringotts about the air rights violations is in the public record. The Wizengamot members have all read it. Several of them are going to spend this afternoon deciding which side of this to be on before it becomes impossible to choose." He looked at Harry. "There is also the matter of the ministry official. Umbridge. When would you like to address that? How much of the supplementary case do you have?" Harry asked. "Enough for a formal filing. 14 children across 11 years, 26 charms total attributable to her wand signature, 3 of whom had additional modifications suggesting coordinated action with a second party." Sharpclaw paused. "The second party in her case is not Dumbledore. Different caster. We're still identifying." Harry thought about this. "File it." "Not today, give the serious proceedings room to develop. But file it before the Board of Governors meeting on Friday." "Strategic," Sharpclaw said. "Give everything room to land before the next thing arrives," Harry said. "If you pile everything at once, people start triaging and the less dramatic items get managed down. Spread out, each thing gets its own space to be real." Sharpclaw looked at him with the bronze eyes. "You should have been a goblin." Harry almost smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." It was intended as one. They left the chamber through the back corridor, and Harry was aware as they walked of eyes following him, not all of them friendly, not all of them hostile, some of them simply the eyes of people who were recalibrating in real time. A middle-aged witch in Wizengamot robes stopped them in the corridor outside the chamber, not blocking them but positioning herself in the way of someone who wanted to be spoken to. "Lord Potter," she said. She had the sharp eyes Harry had noticed in the second tier, and the way she said the title was neither flattering nor disrespectful, it was the way you address someone whose standing you take seriously. "Griselda Marchbanks. I sit on the Wizengamot and the Hogwarts Board of Governors." "Professor," McGonagall said, with a warmth that told Harry this was someone she trusted. "I have been on the board for a long time," Marchbanks said, looking at Harry. "I have been watching certain things with concern for an equally long time. I want you to know, before Friday, that you have at minimum 3 members of the board who are prepared to take the inquiry seriously. Not as a courtesy. As a legal matter." She looked at him with those sharp eyes. "Do you understand what that means, practically speaking?" "It means the inquiry has teeth," Harry said. "It means the inquiry has teeth," she confirmed. "What I need to know from you is how far you intend to take it." Harry looked at her. How far does it need to go? The headmaster, she said, carefully, is the most accomplished wizard alive. He is also, as the documentation makes clear, someone who has operated outside of his legal authority with significant impact on multiple children. The board cannot ignore one, and the other is complicated. She paused. What I'm asking is whether you want punitive action or structural change. Harry thought about Dumbledore in his office, not guilty, still certain. He thought about the expression of a man who believed he'd been right. He thought about what punitive action looked like for a man that powerful. It looked like a fight, drawn out, contested, expensive in time and energy and attention, and at the end of it Dumbledore would be diminished, but the structure that had allowed him to act unchecked would be exactly the same and ready for the next person. Structural change, Harry said. Independent oversight of the headmaster's conduct. A defined legal limit on what the head of Hogwarts can authorize against a student without documented consent. And a mandatory review process for any student who receives more than one diagnostic modification during their time at school. He paused. The Dumbledore piece will be handled by the Wizengamot documentation filing. I don't need the board to punish him. I need the board to make sure no one in that position can do it again. Marchbanks looked at him for a long moment. How old are you? She said. 11, Harry said. Yes, she said. I can see that. She looked at McGonagall. Minerva. This child was in your house for approximately 3 days before he restructured the British wizarding legal landscape. 2 days, actually, McGonagall said. The third day is just beginning. Something moved across Marchbanks's face that was the older person's version of the warmth you feel when something has gone right. Friday, she said to Harry. Bring your goblin. Say what you just said. Say it exactly like that. She moved past them down the corridor with the brisk step of someone who had a great deal to do. McGonagall said quietly, that is a woman who has been waiting for this conversation for 30 years. Harry filed that. They were back at Hogwarts by noon, via the Floo network from the Ministry atrium. McGonagall's hand on his shoulder through the green fire was steady and sure, and Harry came out into the Transfiguration corridor fireplace into a day that was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure, which had become his baseline. Ron was waiting in the corridor. This was not technically allowed, but Ron had the specific Weasley talent for making unauthorized presence look perfectly natural. How did it go? Ron asked, falling into step beside Harry as McGonagall continued down the corridor toward her office. They're moving serious today, Harry said. Ron stopped walking. Harry didn't. Today? Ron caught up. As in today? Transfer order as of this morning. Blimey, said Ron. That's, Harry, he's been in there 9 years, I know. Ron was quiet for a moment, matching Harry's pace. Then, are you all right? Harry thought about the memory projection in the chamber, the dark street, the young man with the grief-shattered face. He thought about the vault letter. I love you. I will be, he said. When I see him. When does the trial happen? 14 days. And you think the memory is goblin sealed, Harry said. It's the most evidentially solid thing in that room. And Ogden saw it. Yes. I think they will. Ron processed this. Then he said, with the blunt honest warmth that was his primary mode, good. That's good. He seemed to feel this was insufficient and added, you deserve to have him. The whole time. You deserve to have someone. Harry looked at Ron sideways. The redhead was looking straight ahead with the expression of someone who'd said a real thing and was now mildly embarrassed about having said it because he wasn't used to saying real things out loud. Thanks, Harry said. Right. Yeah. So. Ron picked up pace slightly. Also, something happened this morning. What? Neville. Harry turned to look at him. Snape, Ron said. First potions class this morning. You missed it because of the hearing. Snape was, he paused, organizing. He was doing the thing where he asks questions to humiliate people. He asked Neville what he'd get if he added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood, which is first-year stuff but technical, and Neville started to answer and Snape talked over him and said, Ron's jaw tightened. He said something about how some students clearly inherited their parents' talents in some subjects and their deficiencies in others. Everyone knew what he meant. Harry was quiet. And normally Neville would have gone red and looked at his desk, Ron continued. But he didn't. He looked at Snape and said, very calmly, that he'd get a draft of living death, and that his father was considered one of the finest orators of his generation and he'd thank the professor not to make implications about his parents' deficiencies given that his parents were tortured into incapacitation by Death Eaters who were subsequently left free by a ministry that Snape's colleagues had significant influence over. Ron paused. The classroom went completely silent. Snape gave him detention. But the point is he said it. Harry absorbed this. Neville said that? Neville said that, Ron confirmed. Fred and George heard about it by second period. They think he's some kind of folk hero. His core's still bound, Harry said. I know. Imagine when it's not. Harry did imagine it, and it was a good image, Neville Longbottom, with his father's courage and his own magic finally accessible to him, standing in a potions dungeon with the steady look of someone who'd decided to stop being small. When's Copperthread scheduled? Ron asked. Saturday, Harry said. Both of us. Ron nodded. They pushed through the door into the corridor that led to the Great Hall and the noise of the lunch crowd reached them. Fred and George also want to talk to you, Ron said. Something about a business proposition. Harry looked at him. I know, said Ron. But they're serious about it, apparently. Something about, they want to develop products. Joke products, but actual ones, properly developed. And they want to know if you'd consider, investing, Harry said. Investing. With the vaults. Ron glanced at him. I'm not telling you to. They're my brothers and I love them and they're geniuses, genuinely, but I know they're also leveraging the fact that you're currently very well disposed toward the Weasley family. I'm disclosing that up front. Harry stopped walking and looked at Ron with an expression that was trying not to be a full smile and not quite succeeding. You're telling me your brothers are trying to get money out of me and warning me about it. You're my mate, Ron said simply. Obviously I'm warning you about it. He paused. But they really are geniuses. Tell them to write up what they want to do, Harry said. Properly. Not a pitch, a plan. What they want to make, what they'd need, what they'd do with investment. If it's good, I'll talk to Sharpclaw. Ron grinned, and it was the wide, pleased grin of someone whose friend has done the right thing in the right way. Right. Yeah. They're going to be so annoying about this. Worth it, Harry said, and pushed through the Great Hall doors. Hermione was at the table with the restricted section books and looked up when Harry sat down with the expression of someone sitting on news. How did it go? Transfer order today. Trial in 14 days. Good. She pushed a piece of parchment across to him. I found the Ministry Initiative. 1988 Unregistered Magical Child Survey. Umbridge ran it. It gave her access to the home addresses and baseline magical profiles of every child in Britain identified as magical but not yet registered at a magical school. She looked at him. Harry, some of those families had no idea this survey was happening. The ministry sent field workers. Umbridge personally supervised several visits. And used the access to cast memory charms, Harry said. On children she identified as, there's a phrase in the internal documentation. I found it in the restricted section report copies. She pointed to a line. Children of uncertain allegiance profile. Which, reading the rest of her documentation, means children who might grow up to sympathize with non-pure blood causes, or children from mixed blood families she wanted to keep politically compliant. Ron said, she was modifying children's memories for political reasons. Yes, Hermione said flatly. She's still working at the ministry, Harry said. Senior Undersecretary, Hermione confirmed. Direct access to the minister. She's been there through 3 ministerial administrations. She looked at Harry. The supplementary case Sharpclaw is building, it needs to include the full scope of the survey. Not just the individual charm incidents. The whole program. I'll write to him tonight, Harry said. He ate lunch with the focused attention of someone fueling for an afternoon, and the afternoon was classes, defense against the dark arts with Quirrell, who smelled of garlic and whose turban had developed, Harry felt, a distinctly uncomfortable quality that he couldn't pin down but didn't like, and herbology in the greenhouses with Professor Sprout, who treated plants with the specific affectionate directness she also used on students. In defense, Quirrell was covering basic shielding theory, which should have been simple and was, but Harry found himself watching the man rather than the lesson with a peripheral discomfort that grew as the class went on. The stutter, the nervous effect, the constant fussing with the turban, they had the texture of performance. Not bad performance. Good enough that you had to look twice, and most people didn't look twice because the performance confirmed what they expected to see. Harry looked twice. After class, in the corridor, he said to Hermione, "What do you know about Quirrell?" She looked at him with the expression of someone who had filed information but hadn't been asked for it yet. He was a well-regarded academic, she said. Took a sabbatical to travel, 2 years ago, apparently. Came back significantly changed according to people who knew him before. He applied for the defense position, got it. Before that he was teaching Muggle studies. She paused. Why? Something feels wrong, Harry said. I don't know what yet. Hermione looked at the space where Quirrell had been. I'll look into the sabbatical. Don't push it yet. Just file it. She nodded and filed it. Saturday came with the particular quality of an October morning in Scotland, which was cold and clear and uncompromising. Harry and Neville took the Gringotts carriages from the school gates. McGonagall had arranged them, and sat in comfortable, quiet non-conversation for most of the journey, the kind of quiet that exists between people who don't need to fill space. Neville had his father's wand in his pocket. Harry noticed but didn't say anything. Copperthread was ready for them both. She did Harry first, the second session, the deeper layer of memory charms, the ones from his early childhood. The memory weaver, a goblin named Silverthorn who worked with a stillness that was almost meditative, spent 90 minutes on the earliest charms, the ones placed on an infant, working with the precision of someone who knew that the wrong movement would take real memories along with the false ones. What came back with the deep charms was different from the surface layer. Not events, the earliest ones weren't memories of events, because Harry hadn't been old enough for event memories. They were something closer to emotional landscape. The sense of a house before Godric's Hollow, not the last house, an earlier one, the first one, wherever his parents had been before everything went wrong. The texture of being carried. A mobile over a crib that made stars on the ceiling when it turned. His mother's voice reading something. His father's laugh, which was apparently very loud and very sudden and came out of nowhere, and which Harry recognized from the portrait with a shock of recognition so specific it almost stopped him. He held all of it carefully, like things that had been in storage too long and needed to be handled with attention before you knew what they were. When Copperthread finished and said, "All surface and middle layer charms removed. The foundation layer, the ones from 15 months, will need another session, the deepest work," Harry sat up and felt the room with the clearest version of himself he'd yet accessed. Something had settled. Something that had been misaligned was more aligned. Not complete, there were still the deepest ones, the 15-months-old ones, but more. He was more of himself than he'd been yesterday. He went out to the waiting area while they prepared for Neville. Neville was in there for 40 minutes. When he came out, he looked different. Not dramatically, physically different. But there was a quality to the way he was standing that hadn't been there before. A weight in his presence, something present in his bearing that had been absent. It was subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention, which Harry was. Neville stood in the waiting area and looked at his hands, and then he looked at Harry, and his expression was the expression of someone who has found out they're larger than they were told. "How do you feel?" Harry asked. "Bigger," Neville said. He paused. "That sounds strange." "No," Harry said. "That sounds accurate." They stopped at Ollivander's on the way back through Diagon Alley. The shop was still and dusty, and Ollivander himself appeared from between shelves with the abrupt immediacy of someone who was always already there, and he looked at Neville with those pale eyes and said, "Longbottom." "I wondered. You've had your father's wand." "Yes," said Neville. "He bought it himself, Frank Longbottom. Cherry and unicorn hair. Excellent for transfiguration." He looked at Neville steadily. "It's not your wand." "I know," Neville said. What followed was an hour of Ollivander and boxes and the electric near-miss quality of wands that almost but didn't, and then one that did, completely and immediately, a warm glow and the smell of something like warm earth and a cascade of leaves from nowhere that drifted down through the dusty shop air and settled on the floor like an acknowledgement. "Oak and dragon heartstring," Ollivander said, holding the box the way you hold something you're releasing. 13 inches. Unyielding. He looked at Neville, and his expression had the quality of a man whose profession involved watching people find themselves. "Excellent for herbology." Neville laughed. It was a short surprised laugh, the laugh of a person who hasn't laughed much recently and the reflex is a little rusty, but it was real. In the carriage back, Neville held the new wand in his lap with both hands, and outside the window the countryside moved past in the grey October light, and Harry watched him hold it and thought about the vault letter and the mobile over the crib and the sound of his father's laugh, and thought that some things, taken away, could be returned. Not all things. Not all damage was reversible. But some things. The trial was on a Wednesday, 12 days after the hearing. Harry attended with Sharpclaw and McGonagall in the gallery. The chamber had a different quality this time, more full, every seat on every tier occupied, and in the gallery above, space had been found for people who weren't Wisengamot members. Several journalists. Ministry officials. Members of the public who had, Harry understood, been following the documentation filings. The chair at the center of the horseshoe was occupied. Sirius Black. Harry had built a picture from the vault letter and the recovered memory feelings and the portrait of his parents that had offered context, but the reality required adjustment. Sirius Black was thin in the way that 9 years of Azkaban made you thin, not just of body but of something less tangible, a hollowing out that showed in the face even when the face was otherwise composed. His hair was long and dark and matted, and his eyes, when they found Harry in the gallery, were the specific kind of grey that look silver in certain light, and what was in them was not the warm-voiced person from the vault letter but someone who had that person somewhere inside them, under significant layers of what Azkaban did to a person. But he was looking at Harry, and Harry was looking at him, and across the chamber the specific recognition of two people who had been important to each other and lost it and were looking at the recovery of it was its own communication, complete without language. Harry held his gaze and nodded once, and Sirius looked at him with his face doing things he was clearly trying to keep controlled, and then he straightened in the chair and looked at the presiding floor, and that was the most dignified thing Harry had seen in a long time. The trial was 4 hours. The memory was shown again. Testimony was given, a retired orar who had been on the scene in 1981, who now admitted, with the stiff precision of a professional admitting fault, that the circumstances of the arrest had been irregular and that he had filed a report noting this at the time, a report that appeared not to have been acted upon. 3 of the 12 witnesses from the night of Pettigrew's apparent death gave testimony under veritaserum, all 3 confirming that what they had seen was consistent with the memory's account. The ministry was represented by a solicitor who looked like he was trying to conduct a defense without any actual defense to offer, and whose most aggressive moments were technical objections that Ogden overruled with the patience of someone who had a very long patience and was using all of it. Dumbledore was not present. Harry had wondered about that. Marchbanks, in a brief word before the proceedings, had told him that Dumbledore had submitted written testimony supporting the trial, which was noted and filed. He had not attended in person. McGonagall had said, when Harry had raised it, that she thought this was Dumbledore's version of an acknowledgement, not a confession, not an apology, but a removal of obstruction. Harry had accepted that. Not with warmth, but with the pragmatic recognition that it was better than the alternative. When Ogden read the verdict, not guilty, all charges, immediate release, full restoration of legal standing and assets, the chamber made a sound that was less the controlled response of an institution and more the uncontrolled response of people who had been waiting a long time for something to go right. In the gallery, Sharpclaw allowed himself a single small nod of confirmation, as though something had been entered correctly in a ledger he'd been keeping. McGonagall, beside Harry, made no sound, but her hand found his shoulder briefly, the same gesture as the night they'd walked down to the Gringotts carriages, and it meant the same thing it had meant then. Harry watched them remove the chains from Sirius's wrists. He watched Sirius stand from the chair, and the standing was the act of a person reclaiming the vertical dimension they'd been denied for 9 years. He stood and he was still thin and still hollow in the middle places and still carrying what Azkaban did to you, but he was standing, and then he looked up at the gallery, and Harry stood up too, because the gallery seats were irrelevant. They met in the corridor outside the chamber 20 minutes later, when the formal dissolution of the proceedings had allowed for movement. Sharpclaw had handled the paperwork. There was always paperwork. Harry was beginning to understand that the practice of law was primarily a documentation exercise, and McGonagall had stood at a respectful distance that communicated take as long as you need. Sirius was standing in the corridor and Harry walked up to him and they looked at each other, and Sirius said, in the low warm voice that was rougher and rawer than the memory of it but unmistakably the same voice, "You're so much like James." "People keep saying that," Harry said. Sirius made a sound that was almost the laugh from the vault letter. "Yeah, we would." He looked at Harry, looking at him the way you look at something you lost and recovered, checking that it's real. How did you find the letter?" "The vault, Gringotts ran an inheritance test." "Long story. I'll tell you all of it." Harry paused. "Are you all right?" The question hung there. Sirius looked at him and the honest answer was visible in his face. The honest answer was no, not yet, not for a while, but what he said was, "I will be," and Harry recognized those words because he'd said them himself, and they meant the same thing from both of them. "You need healers," Harry said. "The Azkaban effects, I know." Sirius looked at him with something that was trying to be his natural mode of expression, the lightness that the vault letter had held, and finding it was harder to access than it used to be but not gone. "Are you managing everything?" "Because based on what Sharpclaws told me, and he has told me a great deal, the goblins are very thorough." I've been busy," Harry agreed. 11 years old and you single-handedly, 12 in July, Harry said. "Restructured an entire legal institution, I had help. Got me a trial, the memory you left in the vault got you the trial." Sirius looked at him. "You went back there at 11 years old and found a letter an innocent man left in a vault 9 years ago and actually did something about it." He stopped. His face did the thing it had been trying not to do, and he let it, and it was the face of someone experiencing too many large feelings at once and deciding that was all right. "James would be insufferable about this," he said, which was the way people say James would have been so proud when they can't say it directly yet. "I know," Harry said. They stood in the corridor of the Wizengamot for a moment, the two of them, while around them the institution processed and documented and moved on, and Harry thought that some things, taken away, really could be returned. Not the same as they were. Sirius would carry Azkaban for a long time. Harry would carry the charms and the Dursleys and the specific shape of 11 years of managed ignorance. But some things could be returned. Healers first, Harry thought practically. Then everything else. He looked at Sharpclaw across the corridor, and Sharpclaw looked back with the bronze eyes and the acknowledgement of a man whose ledger had a satisfactory entry, and then he produced another parchment, because there was always another parchment, and Harry thought that was probably fine. There was a great deal still to do. He was not afraid of any of it. Chapter 5, What the Charms Were Hiding. The third Gringotts session was scheduled for a Thursday in November, 5 weeks after the trial. Silverthorn, the memory weaver, had asked for the interval deliberately. The deeper the charms, he'd explained to Harry in the particular flat factual manner that goblins used for medical information, the more the surrounding memory architecture needed time to stabilize between removals. Take out the middle layers and then immediately excavate the foundation, and you risked collapse, not of the mind itself, but of the connective tissue between memories, the associative structure that made recalled experience coherent rather than fragmentary. Harry had waited. He was not naturally patient, but he was practically patient, which was different, the patience of someone who understood that rushing a thing ruined it, not the patience of someone who didn't mind waiting. In the 5 weeks, other things had happened. Sirius was at St. Mungo's, 3rd floor, long-term recovery ward, where the healers were working through the accumulated damage of 9 years with Dementors with the systematic care of people who understood that Azkaban damage was real and specific and required real and specific treatment. Harry visited every Saturday. The visits were still getting easier, which meant they'd started from a low baseline. The first one had been mostly silence, both of them adjusting to the reality of each other, Sirius in the standard-issue ward robes looking like a sketch of himself rather than the finished drawing. By the 4th visit they were talking properly, filling in the 9 years from their respective sides. Sirius talked about Harry's parents the way you talk about people who made you who you are, with the specific combination of love and humor and grief that can only come from someone who knew them as real people rather than martyrs. James Potter, apparently, had been brilliant and occasionally insufferable and deeply loyal and the kind of friend who showed up at 3 in the morning with butterbeer when you were having a terrible night, no questions asked. Lily Potter had been the sharpest person in any room she entered and had also been the only person James had ever met who was not remotely impressed by him, which was why he'd fallen hopelessly in love with her in about 6 months and spent the following 2 years making an idiot of himself. Harry listened to all of this with the attention of someone assembling something they needed and filling in the gaps. At Hogwarts, the Board of Governors' inquiry was proceeding. Marchbanks had been accurate about the teeth. 2 other members had joined her position, and Sharpclaw had appeared at the Friday meeting with the documentation organized into a presentation that Harry suspected had genuinely alarmed people who thought they understood the scope of what had happened. By the second meeting, the board had drafted 3 new charter amendments: independent review panel for any modifications to a student's magical core, mandatory Gringotts notification for any memory charm cast on a Hogwarts student, and a formal separation of the headmaster's pastoral authority from his administrative authority so that neither could be used to justify overriding the other. Dumbledore had cooperated with all of it. Not enthusiastically, there was no enthusiasm in his cooperation, which was the cooperation of a man who had recognized the limits of his position and was working within them with dignity. He was still the headmaster. He was still the most accomplished wizard alive. He taught, or oversaw the teaching, and managed the school, and was present at meals and in the corridors, and Harry passed him occasionally and they exchanged looks that were neither warm nor hostile, the looks of 2 people who had had a necessary conversation and were now figuring out what came after it. It was Snape who surprised him. Harry had expected Snape to be a problem. The man had looked at him with those flat black eyes in the potions dungeon on the first day and asked him a question clearly designed to humiliate: what would you get if you added Bezoar to a standard confusion concoction? And Harry had answered it correctly and held the eye contact, and the dungeon had been very quiet for a moment before Snape moved on. Since then there had been a watchful quality to Snape in Harry's presence, less the contemptuous disdain he deployed on most students and more something that was harder to name. Evaluative. Like someone revising a calculation they thought was settled. The revision, Harry understood, had started in the Great Hall on the first night. Snape had been one of Dumbledore's, not an instrument, nothing so simple, but someone whose position and safety had been deeply tied to Dumbledore's management of the post-war situation. The unmasking of what that management actually involved had done something to Snape's internal architecture that hadn't finished settling. Harry watched it the way you watch a building that's been significantly altered, same structure, different load-bearing points. In November, Snape had called Harry back after potions, and the rest of the class had filed out with the specific curiosity of people who thought they were about to witness something and were disappointed to be missing it. "Your last essay," Snape had said, placing the parchment on the desk between them, "was correct in its conclusions and unusually poor in its citation of the supporting evidence." Harry had looked at the essay. "I didn't have the right source text. The restricted section has the flannel papers but they're catalogued wrong. They're under F for flannel when they should be under A for alchemy. I couldn't find the actual references so I cited the secondary source." Snape had looked at him for a moment. Then he'd said, "The catalogue issue has been raised before. I'll note it to the librarian." A pause. "Resubmit with proper citations. Within the week." It was not an apology and it was not warmth and it was not a declaration of anything. But it was something. A form of respect that Snape expressed through the language of standards rather than softness. Harry would take it. Neville's transformation was quieter and more gradual and more real than anything dramatic could have been. The new wand had changed his herbology immediately. Professor Sprout had noticed in the second-class post-removal and had looked at him with the kind of surprise that becomes delight, the surprise of a teacher seeing a student suddenly become who they were going to be. His transfiguration had improved. His charms were good. Even potions, even in Snape's dungeon with the specific pressure of that room, he was more present, more able, less occupied with managing his own anxiety about being inadequate. He was still adjusting to it, Harry thought. Like someone who'd been short-sighted their whole life and been given glasses, the world was the same world but you kept stopping to look at things because you could see them now. Augusta Longbottom had come to Hogwarts 2 weeks after the removal. Harry had not been present for that conversation, and Neville had not offered the details, but he'd come back from it with an expression that was the expression of someone who'd been through something significant and come out on the other side of it with something they hadn't had going in. He'd said, simply, that his grandmother had cried, which Neville had never seen before, and that she'd asked him to forgive her, and that he had. Harry thought that was probably the most important thing that had happened in November. The morning of the third Gringotts session was grey and sharp. Harry went down to breakfast, ate, and found Hermione already at the table with the look of someone who had discovered something and was deciding how to present it. "What?" Harry said, sitting down. "Quirrell," she said. Harry had been intermittently filing the Quirrell problem for 5 weeks. The wrongness of the man had not diminished, if anything it had grown more specific, more textured, the way you learn to define an unease once you've had time to feel it. Something beneath the surface of Quirrell, behind the stutter and the garlic and the nervous performance, was large and cold and patient. "Tell me," Harry said. "His sabbatical," Hermione said. She pushed a folded piece of parchment across the table. "I found a reference in a 1989 issue of Transfiguration today. There was a small piece about academic departures. Quirrell was mentioned. He went to Albania." "Albania." Harry looked at the word on the parchment. "Albania," Ron said, from across the table, through a mouthful of toast. He swallowed. "Isn't that where Voldemort was rumored to have gone after his body was destroyed?" Hermione said, with the precise flatness of someone saying a sentence that has significant implications and choosing to say it plainly rather than around the edges. "There are several mentions in the restricted section sources, speculation about where a disembodied dark magical presence would go to hide and recover. Albania came up specifically in 2 sources because of its magical isolation and historical association with certain dark magical practices." Harry looked at the parchment. He thought about the discomfort in Quirrell's classroom, the thing that felt like performance, the thing that felt cold and patient underneath it. He thought about the turban. "He went to Albania 2 years ago," Harry said. "He came back changed." "Yes," Hermione said. "And now he's teaching defense against the dark arts at Hogwarts." Harry folded the parchment and put it in his pocket. Which is perfect positioning for someone who wanted access to. He stopped. What's in this school that's worth protecting? Hermione and Ron looked at each other. There's the thing on the 3rd floor, Ron said carefully. Harry looked at him. What thing on the 3rd floor? Fluffy, said Ron. I beg your pardon? Hagrid's, it's Hagrid's dog, Ron said. 3-headed dog. He's got it in the Forbidden Corridor. Fred and George found out because Fred tried to nick a late-night snack through the corridor route and nearly lost an arm. The dog is guarding something. There's a trapdoor. Harry thought about the first night at Hogwarts, which had been rather occupied with other things. He thought about Dumbledore's announcement at the start of term feast. He'd been told about it afterward, the warning about the 3rd floor corridor. Not a casual warning. A specific one. Something is being stored there, Harry said. Something significant enough to need a 3-headed dog. And a defense against the dark arts teacher who came back from Albania acting like a different person, Hermione said, and the three of them sat with this thought for a moment, the way you sit with a thought when it's rearranged several other thoughts in the process of arriving. I'll address this after today, Harry said. Gringotts first. Then the 3rd floor. He paused. Don't go near that corridor without me. Obviously, said Hermione. Ron said, I wasn't going to, in a tone that suggested he had briefly considered it and was now reconsidering. The carriage to Gringotts took its usual 40 minutes, and Harry spent the journey in the particular quality of quiet that precedes something large. He'd described it to Sirius the week before, the feeling that there was a layer of himself he hadn't reached yet, something the Foundation charms were covering that was not just memory but something structural. Sirius had listened and said, carefully, your mother was not an ordinary witch. What she did, the sacrifice, the protection, it wasn't just love. Love was the mechanism. But what she channeled it through was something specific to her. Something in her blood. He'd paused. She knew things, Harry. She figured things out. Toward the end she was working on something, she and your dad both, and I never knew the full scope of it because they were careful about what they told me after the Pettigrew situation started feeling wrong. Another pause. I think you're going to find out what it was. Harry thought about that in the carriage. Silverthorn was waiting in the curse-breaking suite with the stillness of someone who had prepared thoroughly and was now simply present. Copperthread was there too, for support on the structural side. The room had the same amber runes and the same cool air, and Harry got on the table with the practiced ease of someone who'd been there before. These are the Foundation charms, Silverthorn said. He had a voice like dry leaves, not unpleasant, just ancient. Placed when you were 15 months old. I want to tell you clearly what this means before we begin. He looked at Harry with the focused attention of someone who considered informed consent important enough to say the thing even to an 11-year-old. At 15 months, a human child does not have formed declarative memory. What these charms covered is not a set of recallable events. What they covered is foundational pattern, the deep structure of how you process and engage with magic. The charms did not simply hide things from you. They altered the base configuration of your magical engagement. Harry absorbed this. So when they come off, you will not remember events, Silverthorn said. You will reconfigure. The base will shift. It may be disorienting. It may take several hours or several days to fully settle. He paused. It may be significant. How significant? Harry asked. Silverthorn considered this with the manner of someone choosing accuracy over reassurance. I have removed Foundation charms 3 times in my career, he said. Each case was different. In all 3 cases the individual reported a fundamental shift in how magic felt to them and in the scope of their natural abilities. In all 3 cases the shift was toward greater capacity. He held Harry's gaze. You are not ordinary. The inheritance test told us this. The foundation charms were placed by someone who knew exactly what they were suppressing. I cannot tell you what you will find. I can tell you it will be real. All right, Harry said. Let's go. Silverthorn worked for 2 hours. It was different from the previous sessions. The surface and middle charms had come off like things being removed, extracted, plucked, the sensation of specific things being taken away. This was more like water being drained from somewhere that had been submerged. A slow revelation rather than an extraction. Not painful, it was almost meditative in texture, though meditation was not something Harry had extensive experience with, so he was working from instinct. He lay still and felt Silverthorn's hands moving in the air above him, following currents he could feel but not see. And then something happened that was not like anything else. It arrived the way dawn arrives, not a moment but a process, a gradual illumination, something becoming visible by degrees. It was his magic. It was his magic, and it was large. Not large the way the limiter removal had shown him, though that had been significant. This was something that didn't have a comfortable human-scale metaphor, like standing at the edge of an ocean when you've only ever seen ponds. Not frightening. Just true. Just the accurate scale of the thing. It moved differently. He felt it move through him not as a resource he accessed but as something more integral, more present, less a tool and more a dimension of how he was made. He understood, lying on the stone table in Gringotts' curse-breaking suite, that his mother had put something into him. Not the protection specifically, though the protection was there, recognizable now as a distinct layer, her love, channeled through her sacrifice, wrapped around him like something living. But underneath that, or within it, something that was Lily Potter's gift to her child in a different sense. Not the protection. Something she'd built into the foundation. A resonance. An attunement. He understood things about magic that he hadn't understood 20 minutes ago, not through learning but through access, like finding a language you already spoke but had been prevented from speaking. The mechanics of magic felt transparent to him in a way they hadn't before, the connective logic between intention and effect, the architecture of spell work, the grammar of magical interaction. He lay on the table and felt it arrange itself like a library sorting its own books, and it was extraordinary. Silverthorn said, very quietly, "Done." Harry sat up. The room was the same. The amber runes. The shelves. Copper thread at the far wall. Silverthorn with his hands lowered, watching Harry with ancient eyes that were doing what ancient eyes do, which is recognize things. "What do you feel?" Copperthread asked. Harry thought about how to answer this accurately. "Everything is sharper," he said. "The magic in this room, the runes, the preservation charms on the shelves, the detection arrays, I can feel all of it. Not just sense it. I can feel how it's built." He looked at his hands. "My mother did something. To the foundation layer." "Yes," said Silverthorn. "There was something woven into the structure that was not a charm and not a curse. Something more fundamental. Do you know what it is?" "Arithmancy," Harry said, and knew it was true as he said it. She was working on something involving arithmetic mapping of magical cores. She embedded a framework into mine. He paused. "A framework for what?" Silverthorn was quiet for a moment. "I could feel it but not read it. I am a memory weaver, not an arithmancer. What I can tell you is that whatever she built into your foundation, it interacts with your magical core at every level. It is not a separate thing. It is part of how you work." He looked at Harry. "She built it deliberately, with extraordinary precision, for a child 15 months old. She knew something was coming. She prepared." Harry sat with this. Lily Potter, who had been the sharpest person in any room she entered, had seen what was coming and had spent her last weeks or months preparing not just the sacrificial protection but something deeper. Something she'd put into the bones of her son's magic for him to find when he was ready. What Harry felt, sitting on the stone table, was not grief exactly. grief was something he'd carry for the portrait in the vault, and the voice from the mobile, and the laugh like something being delighted, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. The weight of being loved with such precision. The weight of a parent's complete attention to your survival. He breathed once, deeply. Then he got off the table and said, "Sharpclaw, I need to ask you something." Sharpclaw was in the doorway. He'd come in at some point during the session, standing with the quiet of someone who knew when to be present without being intrusive. Yes. The loyalty suppressor. The very first modification, placed before Dumbledore's, placed before anything else. You said you were still identifying the caster. Yes. It was placed at 15 months old. Right after my parents died. In the immediate aftermath. Harry looked at Sharpclaw. Who had access to me in that window? Who knew where I was before Dumbledore moved me to the Dursleys? Sharpclaw was still. That is the question we have been working on, he said. The window is approximately 36 hours, from the time of your parents' deaths to the time Dumbledore collected you and placed you at Privet Drive. During that window, the record shows 2 visitors to the ruins of your parents' house in Godric's Hollow, beyond Sirius Black and Rubeus Hagrid, who are documented. He paused. One was Alastor Moody, who has confirmed his visit and whose wand signature does not match. And the other? Unknown, Sharpclaw said. The signature is not in the Ministry Registry. It is old work, older than the Ministry Registry, which only goes back 200 years. The magical technique is not British in origin. He held Harry's gaze. We are working with international contacts to identify it. We will. Harry filed this. The unnamed visitor. The loyalty suppressor that predated everything else, placed on an infant in the smoking ruins of a house where 2 people had just died. The question of who had known, in that 36-hour window, that the child who had survived was worth suppressing. Keep working on it, Harry said. And tell me immediately when you know. Of course, said Sharpclaw. They were back at Hogwarts by early afternoon. Harry went directly to the library, not for books but for Hermione, who was there in her natural habitat with 3 reference texts and the expression of someone who had been usefully occupied in his absence. I need the arithmancy section, Harry said, sitting across from her. She looked up. Something in his face made her look more carefully. How was it? Significant, he said. My mother was an arithmancer. She built something into my core. I want to understand the theory. He paused. What do you know about arithmantic core weaving? Hermione's expression did the thing it did when she was accessing information she was genuinely excited about. It's ancient practice. Pre-ministry. It's theoretically possible to weave arithmantic structures into a magical core, but the precision required is extraordinary because you're working with living magic, not inert material. The few documented cases are all from the pre-classical period. She stopped. Harry. Are you saying your mother successfully did this? To an infant? To a 15-month-old, he said. Hermione stared at him. Then she stood up and went to the arithmancy shelves with the focused energy of someone who has identified the most important thing in the room and is going to it immediately. She came back with 4 books. They worked through the afternoon, Hermione translating the theoretical framework into comprehensible language and Harry reading the theory against the internal experience of what he now felt in his magic, cross-referencing the external description with the internal reality. It was the most useful kind of learning, not abstract, but immediate, the theory illuminating what he already knew from the inside. The framework his mother had built, as far as Harry could understand it from the available theory, was something like a resonance amplifier, a structure that allowed his magical core to attune with external magical constructs, read their architecture, understand their mechanics at a fundamental level. Not automatically. Not without effort. But as a capacity, a potential, that with training and development could become. It's a magical analysis framework, Hermione said, looking up from the 5th book. Harry, this is, if I'm reading this correctly, this allows you to understand the structural mechanics of any spell you encounter. Not just see it, understand it. At the foundation level. She looked at him. The practical applications of that are enormous, Harry said. It would mean that with exposure and attention you could understand how any magic works, Harry said. Not just use it. Understand the architecture of it. He thought about what Silverthorn had said. Whatever she built into your foundation, it interacts with your magical core at every level. He thought about the way the runes in the curse-breaking suite had felt transparent to him when he stood up from the table. She built me a way to see magic. The full structure of it. Hermione sat back and looked at him with an expression that was navigating between the professional respect of someone recognizing extraordinary work and the personal awe of someone who just understood the scale of a thing. She was trying to make sure you could defeat him, Hermione said. Not by making you powerful, by making you able to understand how magic works at a level he couldn't. Voldemort is a brilliant wizard, Harry said. Powerful, creative, technically extraordinary. But everything he does is about force and application. My mother found a different angle. He paused. She was brilliant too. Hermione said, quietly, she really was. They closed the books as dinner approached, and Harry sat for a moment with the afternoon's wait before he stood. He thought about going to see Sirius on Saturday and telling him what they'd found. He thought about Sirius saying she was working on something toward the end. He thought about the portrait in the vault and what it would mean to tell his mother's portrait what had been in the foundation all along. He thought about Quirrell. The third floor, Harry said. Tonight? Hermione asked. After dinner, Harry said. I want to see what's being protected. If Voldemort is in this building in some form, he paused. I want to know what he's here for. Ron, who had appeared in the library with the uncanny timing of someone who'd been looking for them and found them, said, I'm coming. Ron, I'm coming, Ron said again, with the simple directness of someone who has assessed the situation and made his decision and the decision is not negotiable. You're not going to a corridor with a three-headed dog and a possibly Voldemort-adjacent teacher without me. Harry looked at him. Then at Hermione, who was already putting her books away. Obviously I'm coming as well, she said. Someone needs to make sure you two don't do something irretrievable. We're 11, Ron said. 11-year-olds have done irretrievable things before, Hermione said. Neville appeared around the shelving unit with the expression of someone who had been listening for the last 30 seconds and had already decided. I know the castle better than anyone, he said. I've been exploring since the first week. I know a route to the third floor that avoids every portrait that reports back to the staff. He paused. I was going to tell you about it eventually. Harry looked at him. What? Neville said. I was being thorough. They went after dinner, using the route Neville had mapped, a back staircase behind the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy, up through a servant's passage that hadn't been used as such in a century, emerging on the third floor through a panel in the wainscoting that responded to magical pressure in a way that suggested it had been designed as an exit rather than just a wall. The corridor was dark and still. The door at the end was locked. Harry looked at it. He felt the lock structure with the new attunement, the mechanism of it, the layers, the particular design. Alohomora, he said, and because he understood the lock's architecture and was addressing it accurately rather than approximately, it opened cleanly on the first attempt. The three-headed dog was enormous. It was also asleep. There was a harp on the floor near it, enchanted to play, winding down toward silence. Someone had been here before them, someone had put the dog to sleep and come through this room, and recently, because the harp was still playing. Someone else is here, Hermione breathed. Tonight, Harry said. He was already looking at the trapdoor in the floor between the dog's massive paws. He moved toward it, stepping carefully, and the dog breathed in the massive slow cadence of deep enchanted sleep, and Harry reached the trapdoor and opened it and felt the air from below, cold and dark and moving. Ron said, very quietly, are we actually doing this? Someone's down there right now, Harry said. Someone who put Fluffy to sleep and opened this trapdoor. Tonight. He looked at the others. What are they going to do to whatever's down there while we stand here? A pause. Then Neville opened his palm and his wand produced a clean white light, and he said, "Shall we?" with the calm of someone who has decided to be the person his new wand thinks he is. They went down. The chamber below the trapdoor had a plant, Devil's Snare. Hermione identified it immediately and lit her wand and it retreated, and then a series of chambers beyond it, each one a different obstacle. Flying keys in a vast dark room, which Harry dealt with by understanding the current patterns of their flight with the new attunement and plucking the right key from mid-air in a single pass on a school broom. A giant chess set that Ron took over with the specific focused authority of someone who'd grown up playing chess against older siblings and had consequently developed a fairly high pain threshold for difficult games. Harry watched Ron play the board with an economy of movement and a willingness to sacrifice his own peace, himself, sitting as a knight, that Harry noted with a particular attention. The willingness to stand in harm's way for the outcome, not from recklessness but from calculation. He was fine. The board recognized checkmate and the pieces cleared. The chamber beyond the chessboard held a troll, already unconscious. Someone had knocked it out on the way through. The chamber after that was potions and a logic puzzle, which Hermione solved in the time it would have taken anyone else to read it. "You three go back," Hermione said, at the final door. She pressed a small bottle into Harry's hand. "This one gets you through. I think you need to go alone. Whatever is in there is," she paused. "I've been thinking about what you told us. The arithmetic framework. If Voldemort is in there, in some form, and if he's here for whatever's being protected, then this is between me and him," Harry said. "That's not what I was going to say," Hermione said. "I was going to say that whatever form he's in, he's going to be less than he was. You are not less than you were. In fact you're," she gestured, a gesture that communicated considerably more than you were previously without needing more words. "Go back to the entrance," Harry said. "If I'm not back in 20 minutes, we'll get McGonagall," Ron said. "Get Sharpclaw too," Harry said. "Just in case." He drank the potion, which was cold and tasted of calculation, and he went through the door. The final chamber was lit by its own magic, that cold, sourceless light that magical spaces generated when nothing else was available. It was a small chamber, stone walls, and at the center on a stone plinth sat a small, round, intensely red stone. The Philosopher's Stone. Harry knew it without being told, the way he now knew things about magic, from the inside out, from the structure of what it was radiating. Enormous power. Alchemical completion. Centuries of refinement. Quirrell was standing in front of it. The stutter was gone. The nervous quality was gone. He'd unwound the turban as Harry entered, and his back was to Harry, and when he turned around what Harry saw on the back of Quirrell's head confirmed what he'd been half expecting for weeks. A face. On the back of Quirrell's skull. Purple and scarred and barely present, barely corporeal, the remnant of a being reduced to a fragment and living parasitically in the only body available. Voldemort. What was left of him? "Harry Potter," said the face, in a voice like something dry being scraped across stone. At last. Harry stood in the chamber and looked at what Voldemort had been reduced to, and what he felt was not the fear that had been presumably the anticipated reaction. He felt the analytical clarity of the arithmetic framework engaging with the magic in the room, reading Quirrell's possession, reading the connection between the fragment of Voldemort and the stone on the plinth, reading the structure of the situation. "You're not going to get the stone," Harry said. "I am already getting the stone," Voldemort said, in that desiccated whisper. "Quirrell, take it." Quirrell moved toward the plinth. Harry moved first. It wasn't the explosive confrontation of someone who'd been building toward a dramatic moment. It was quicker and more practical than that. He'd felt, in the 5 seconds since entering the room, the structure of Quirrell's possession, the way Voldemort's fragment was attached to Quirrell's magical core, the specific mechanics of the parasitic bond. He'd felt the stone's protective enchantments, which were keyed to intent, which was why Dumbledore had used a mirror, presumably, why the stone would only come to someone who wanted to find it but not use it. But Harry's understanding of the stone's enchantments was deeper than that now. He could read the architecture. He could see the keystone. He crossed the chamber in 4 steps, intercepted Quirrell's outstretched hand before it reached the stone, and gripped his wrist. The reaction was immediate and violent. The physical contact between Harry's hands and Quirrell's skin triggered something in the protective magic Lily Potter had woven into his foundation, and the reaction burned outward like a wave. Quirrell screamed. The parasitic connection between Voldemort's fragment and Quirrell's core ruptured under the contact, not because Harry was trying to rupture it, but because Lily's framework and Voldemort's magic were fundamentally incompatible at the architectural level, and contact between them was catastrophic for the weaker structure. For the fragment, the contact was the same as it had been when Voldemort had tried to kill a 15-month-old. The same magic. The same answer. Quirrell's screaming intensified and then stopped, not because the pain had stopped but because Quirrell had lost consciousness, and Harry stepped back and felt the chamber's magic redistributing, the parasitic bond dissolved, and what was left of Voldemort's fragment dispersed into the air with a sound like something tearing. Not destroyed. Harry felt that clearly, not destroyed, dispersed. The fragment was not gone from the world. But it was gone from this room and gone from Quirrell's skull and gone from whatever plan had brought it here tonight. He stood in the chamber alone for a moment. Quirrell was unconscious on the floor. The stone was on its plinth, untouched. The chamber was very quiet. Harry looked at the stone for a long moment. Then he picked it up, because leaving it here with Quirrell potentially recovering was not sensible, and carried it to the door, and went back through the sequence of chambers, through the chess room where Ron had swept the pieces aside to clear his path, through the key room, through the devil's snare chamber, and arrived back at the original chamber, at the trapdoor, and climbed back up into the corridor. Ron and Hermione and Neville were there. They'd waited. Hermione looked at his face. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Harry said. He held up the stone. "We need to give this to McGonagall." "Is Quirrell?" Ron started. "Unconscious," Harry said. "And Voldemort's gone from him." The fragment dispersed. He paused. "He's not dead. Voldemort's not gone. He's dispersed. But not from this building, not from this stone." He looked at the 3 of them. "Let's go." They walked down the corridor, for first years in the middle of the night carrying the Philosopher's Stone through a school that was mostly asleep, and Ron said, "Did you just—" "Yes," Harry said. "By yourself?" "You were at the chess board," Harry said. "I was," Ron said. "Good board." A pause. "You know what I mean." "I know," Harry said. "I'll explain the magic to Hermione later and she'll explain it to you. The short version is my mother built something into me and it turns out it's specifically bad news for Voldemort." Neville, who had been quiet with the quality of someone who was going to say something when he'd finished thinking it, said, "Is it going to keep being like this? I mean, is every year at Hogwarts going to be? I genuinely don't know," Harry said. "Right," said Neville. "Okay." He seemed to accept this with the equanimity of someone who had adjusted their baseline for what a normal year looked like. "I'll keep mapping the castle." "Please do," Harry said. McGonagall's fireplace lit on the first knock, which meant she'd been awake, which meant the portraits had been talking. She opened her office door and looked at the 4 of them and then at the stone in Harry's hand, and for a moment her face did several things in rapid succession that were all the faces of a person processing a great deal of information at once. Then she said, very calmly, "Come in. All of you. Sit down." She took the stone from Harry with the careful reverence of someone handling something significant and set it on her desk. "Someone will need to start explaining." "Harry should," said Ron. It was mostly his thing. It was all of our thing, Harry said. Neville knew the route. Hermione solved the logic puzzle. Ron played the chess board. He looked at McGonagall. We each did our part. McGonagall looked at them, for 11-year-olds in their robes at midnight with the Philosopher's Stone on the desk and whatever was on their faces, and something in her expression found that particular quality it found occasionally now, the quality that wasn't quite pride but was something that lived in Pride's house. Professor Quirrell is in the final chamber, Harry said. He needs medical attention. He was being possessed by Voldemort's fragment and the possession was disrupted. I don't know what that does to a person. McGonagall's hand was already on her wand. I'm sending for Dumbledore and the healers simultaneously. She paused. Are any of you hurt? No, Harry said, and looked at the others, who all confirmed no. Right, said McGonagall. She looked at Harry with a directness that contained the full weight of what she'd watched unfold since the night in the Great Hall. You will tell me everything. Tonight, all of it, from the beginning of how you knew. She paused. But first, she crossed to the desk and opened the drawer and produced, with the decisive movement of someone who had been saving this for the right moment, 4 small, identical badges. She set them on the desk. Special commendation badges, she said. The board approved them last week as part of the new student recognition charter. First time they've been awarded in 40 years. She looked at them steadily. I expect you to wear them at breakfast. Yes, Professor, Hermione said, immediately. Ron picked his up and turned it over. It was small and gold and on it was a griffin. Wicked, he said. Neville held his very carefully, the way he held his new wand, like something that was his and he was going to take care of. Harry looked at his for a moment. A small gold badge. He thought about the Great Hall and the Hat's voice and the carriage to Gringotts and the vault and the portrait and the trial chamber and Sirius standing up from the chair. He thought about his mother lying something extraordinary into the bones of his magic for him to find. He thought about 4 first years walking through a castle at midnight with a Philosopher's Stone and coming back fine. He put the badge in his pocket. McGonagall began her Patronus to Dumbledore. Outside the castle, the Scottish night was doing what it did in November, which was being cold and clear and large, and the stars were out above the Highlands in the specific extravagant way of stars that had no competition, and Harry stood for a moment at McGonagall's window while she sent her messages and Ron and Hermione and Neville sat in the chairs and were, very understandably, tired. He thought about what Silverthorn had said. I cannot tell you what you will find. I can tell you it will be real. It was real. All of it was real, the framework, the clarity, the size of his own magic now that there was nothing sitting on it. The understanding of magical architecture that meant every spell he cast was a conversation rather than an instruction. His mother's gift, precise and deliberate and brilliant and made for him specifically. He was 11 years old and he had dispersed a fragment of the darkest wizard in a century using magic his mother had built into his bones before he could walk. He was going to need to think about what came next. He turned back to the room, and McGonagall was looking at him, and the room was warm, and his friends were in it. That was a good start.